everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. Um, we are looking forward to having Ken Crable present on trauma-informed care. And so one thing I wanted to talk about is if you could please put your name and your organization that you work for and your title in the chat. That way I can keep track of who is on the line today. And so we really appreciate you guys being here. So I am going to turn it, I'm Diane Halo. I'm from Greater Columbia Accountable Community of Health. And I will turn the time over to Ken Crable.
Thanks, Diane. And hello, everyone. I am delighted to be with you. I'm coming to you from Western Washington in Seattle, and I'm presuming most of you are in somewhere in Eastern Washington in the Tri-Cities area. I am very pleased to be here. I've had the pleasure of meeting Diane previously and working with the Greater Columbia Accountable Community of Health. And so I'm happy to be invited back. So the music that you heard was really intended just to create a little bit of an uplift for your spirits, given that the topic today is a hard one to talk about. And we're going to be talking about trauma-informed care, healing-centered care. But in order to do that, we're also going to be talking about what is trauma, its impact, and that in and of itself can be a really hard, difficult kind of subject to take on. So I want to just start by saying that this is a topic that is not unfamiliar to any of us. We've all had trauma in our lives. Of course, we've had that to varying degrees, and many of us have probably been relatively unscathed by trauma, and then others moderately so. And then some of us actually have had significant trauma in their lives that also may go back to early childhood. And so whatever your situation, one of the things we know that even just talking about trauma itself can be triggering and can bring up memories. It can bring up even sort of kind of really uncomfortable feelings and just create a discomfort and even sort of help almost recreate what had happened to us before just by thinking about it and talking about it. So that's the risk in, of course, having this conversation at all. But that said, we also know that trauma is something that we often don't want to talk about and sweep under the rug and want to stay silent about. And that is also very damaging when we don't bring it out into the open. So my invitation to you this morning is to really allow yourself to engage as deeply as you can and as safely as you can. And so if at any point along the way, you find that you're just needing to step back a bit, turn off your camera, step away for a little bit, feel free to do that. That's all very much welcomed and understandable. So just a wee bit about my own background. I'm a social worker by training, and I have worked in the homelessness arena, intersecting with healthcare, intersecting with behavioral healthcare and housing for pretty much all my life. And I started out working in a large shelter in downtown Seattle called Downtown Emergency Service Center. And when I started there in 1982, it was just a large shelter in downtown Seattle. And then over the ensuing years, 30 plus 40 years now, a lot has happened. And we began responding to the needs that people had. And so a healthcare for the homeless program was brought into the site, of which I was a part. And then we added mental health services and addiction services and supported employment services, and then housing, which of course is the solution to homelessness. And so DESC started developing what is today, I think, 1,500 or plus units of permanent supportive housing for people. I say all that because in working in that setting, my job was as part of a mental health team to really engage with people who were struggling with addiction, with mental health issues. And I was often trying to help people gather the documentation for them to apply for entitlements like SSI and SSDI. And in doing so, part of my role was to assess, to do a psychological, psychiatric assessment, and even come up with a provisional diagnosis that I would then share with the psychiatrist I was working with, who had the authority to make a diagnosis, but I was trying to create the documentation around that. And I kind of took pride in fitting people into different categories, like the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the day, did. And so, looking for schizophrenia, looking for depression, looking for anxiety disorders, looking for what we call personality disorders, and more. And what I was discovering is that people just weren't fitting into the boxes the way I wanted them to or hoped they would. And instead, I was seeing people coming with kind of a little bit of everything, it seemed. There was some absolutely anxiety, lots of depressive features, suicidal features, and there were also psychotic features, people experiencing voices and hallucinations. And then there was also kind of these experiences where people described, having flashbacks, and there was these kind of this sense of people being paranoid overall or fearful of things. And then on top of that, there were behavioral patterns that were really often off-putting to those of us as providers. And so what I was seeing is a whole collective of symptoms, if you will. And at that point in time, I was introduced to a book called Trauma and Recovery by Judith Lewis Herman. And it turns out that was a seminal book written in the 1990s. And what that began to do for me and the team I was with is we read that book and we began to reconceptualize what it is we were seeing in people and experiencing. And I'm not here to say that everybody's diagnosis turned into a post-traumatic stress disorder, but I am saying that we really began to take into account how critically important the whole experience of trauma is in helping to shape people's brains, their personalities, their actions, their way they view the world, and all of that. And so ever since then, and it's been a growing trend, we've learned that it's so important to view people through a trauma lens, meaning that just to recognize that people come to us with a backstory. Each of you comes to this space with a backstory. I come to you with a backstory. And we don't have to share all the details of that story. But what we do need to recognize is that that backstory has helped to, in some ways, shape us and not necessarily define us, because we can certainly move on from that, but it has an influence and it makes a difference. So that's kind of a long-winded introduction of myself, but my connection with trauma. And ever since then, I've been trying to steep myself in understanding what trauma is, its impact, and also what it means to be trauma-informed. Now, I'm guessing, I know many of you are community health workers, others of you are supervisors, maybe administrators, and perhaps other things. I do invite you in the chat box, by the way, to introduce yourself and your role, if you wish. Totally up to you, but you're most welcome to do that. So during our time together today, what I'm hoping to do is spend half of our time, more or less, on really delving into the impact of trauma, understanding that, so that we can then understand what it means to respond in a way that is trauma-informed in the second half of our time together. We will be taking a break once an hour here, just a bio break, if you will, a time to relax, to breathe, to just freshen up whatever needs to happen. So please be aware of that as we move forward. So trauma impacts the body, and I'll keep coming back to that theme. And the body, in turn, in responding to trauma, releases stress hormones and cortisol and adrenaline. And what happens is our bodies are built, our brains and bodies are built to respond to any kind of threats or perceived threats in the environment. And when that happens, we become on edge. And when people begin to kind of experience trauma in an ongoing kind of way, that is, their bodies and brains tell them that there's always a need to be on the lookout for a perceived threat, then our bodies start actually becoming anxious and unrelaxed. And so my invitation to you here is simply for us to take 30 seconds together and just on your own to take some nice deep breaths, trying to elongate the out breath. That is, maybe count in for 3 or 4 for your in breath, and then count out for 4 or 5 or 6 even for your out breath, and just allow yourself to kind of luxuriate in your own breathing and paying attention to it though, and mindfully kind of taking a little more time to let it out than to take it in. And that's the only instruction I'm going to provide. Maybe we'll go a little longer than 30 seconds, but please put yourself in a comfortable position if you would, and just allow yourself to calm yourself, if you will, even though you may be perfectly calm now, but see if you can even reach an even deeper state of relaxation and calm in just utilizing your breathing. Here we go. All right, I'll invite you back. You know, it may be that for you, paying attention to your breathing isn't the most relaxing, although for many it is, but it might be that stretching or moving your body or wiggling your toes and your fingers, there are all manner of things that we can do to kind of re reset our bodies, if you will. And so throughout this training, I invite you to do that on your own at any time. And of course, throughout life, it's a good practice too. All right. Thanks to those of you who have introduced yourselves in the chat. I appreciate it. Um, just out of curiosity, what other things do you do to self-regulate, to just bring yourself into a calmer state, if you don't mind? So Brittany says yoga, absolutely. Uh, Yoga is something that's been found to be almost universally effective in helping with stress. Wood carving, nice, yeah. Doing something that's focused and keeps your mind on that here and now that you're doing. Doing lots of reading and beading, yeah, and all kinds of art, yeah, music, guitar, yeah, drawing, prayer, absolutely. Going to the gym with a asterisk. Maybe that's during non-COVID times or something like that. But yeah, anything we can do that takes our minds and our bodies and just reorients them, and particularly reorients them in a way that engages in something that is pleasant, pleasurable, and oftentimes social, like coloring with your kids. That's another whole part of how we self-regulate, by getting outside ourselves and being with friends and cooking and eating and all of those things. So yeah, well, thank you. And I trust that you also have ways that you can do in the moment while you're working, wherever that may be, that allows you to also just take some momentary periods of time for relaxation. I don't need to tell you that we are living in incredibly traumatic times, stressful times. Um, there's COVID, of course, and the variants that are coming after, and all of the impacts that that has had on people's lives and on our country and on everything. And of course, around that too, there's a lot of uh, racist practices and behaviors that have come to the fore in ways that we haven't seen for a long time, or at least haven't acknowledged. And so there's the whole uprising around that that is a good thing, and also it has its own traumatic features. And then there's just the general civil unrest, the political unrest, and then so much more, of course, and what's happening in our own beings, in our own families, in our own work situations. And so we are very familiar with trauma, and um, that's just a given. That said, I think what happens is there is kind of an insidious impact that it has on us that we don't notice day by day, maybe, but over time we begin to see that it takes a toll. And I'm going to guess that each one of you has recognized ways in which these past several years have taken a toll on you, on your mental state, on your emotions, on your psychology, on your spirituality, on your physicality. And I just want to say that's totally normal. It's the way our bodies and brains are built to protect us, to and but it does have a toll that it takes. And I just want to acknowledge that up front. And so and then I'll just say the other part of trauma that sometimes goes unmentioned, uh, in addition to some of these bigger picture traumas, is that trauma that happened in early childhood for many of us. And um, I'm bringing that up because that will be a significant focus of our time together today, because that in particular, what we call developmental trauma, complex trauma, has a particular impact on us in ways that make a can really impact our lives. So let's think about some basic nuts and bolts of trauma. First of all, let's talk about stress for a moment. And I'm here to tell you that stress is a good thing. In fact, we have a term for that. It's called eustress, EUSTRESS. What are some forms of good stress in your lives? And by this, I mean things that, yeah, they create a little bit of attention, but they also turn into creativity. Oftentimes, they turn into something that isn't overwhelmingly going to debilitate you in any way. So deadlines for projects can be good stress because often they motivate us, right? And they keep us going. Raising kids, absolutely. Yes, I've been there. Uh, Preparing for a one-on-one, yeah, yeah. Not quite knowing where that's going to go, whether that's in supervision or even going to therapy or whatever that is. But anytime we prepare to have an encounter with somebody, there's a certain stress. Public speaking, Katie, yes, for sure. And then there are things, just like getting up in the morning and showering and getting together with friends. And I know being a sports fan is something that for many people is a good stress. There's a lot of trauma in being a sports fan, depending on the teams you follow, but there's also kind of this fun stress about it. So yeah, so I just want to acknowledge that stress itself, it exists, and it's not a bad thing at all. In fact, it's something to embrace. Now, what happens, however, is sometimes things turn into negative stress. And now, and even some of the things you've mentioned already can turn into negative stress, but not always. But what do you think about in terms of what starts to wear us down in terms of negative stress? And we carry it, but it does have uh, kind of it begins to have different levels of impact on us. I certainly think in the work setting about wearing too many hats and too few resources. And I see, yeah, the abuse I'm going to kind of hold off for another category, but worrying about things, interpersonal conflicts, certainly things that happen where maybe you're waiting for a test result, multitasking, yeah, the stresses of things that we can't control, absolutely. Family member sick. So these are all negative stressors that we all do experience as well, but they don't kind of pull us off of our feet usually, or at least not for very long. Aging, for sure. Interpersonal conflict, yeah. And then we might talk about traumatic stress. And of course, these things might meld together, but here we're now talking about abuse. We're talking about really significant things that hit us hard and hit us in a way that throws us off our feet, pulls our feet out from under us, if you will. And of course, there's violence, there's community violence, there's interpersonal violence, there's assault, there are hate crimes. We can think about bullying in this capacity. I think certainly the cumulative effects of racism, of sexism, of homophobia, of homelessness, absolutely. What other thoughts come to mind? Certainly, you know, disasters that happen, flooding and fires and all of that. All of these are traumatic stressors for many, many people, depending. And then the intergenerational trauma, thank you for that. And the intergenerational poverty and racism and racial violence and witnessing trauma, which Kristen, you make a really good point. And just to emphasize here that whether you are a witness to or a direct sort of in the direct line of fire, if you will, of certain traumatic events, apparently makes very little difference in the impacts. That witnessing trauma in and of itself still creates all of those things that happen in our bodies and our minds and our spirits. Now, when traumatic stress is something that continues on and is unresolved, it can often turn into what we call post-traumatic stress, sometimes called post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is when events continue or symptoms continue to live on long past the event or events have passed. And so many of you probably are familiar with, the phenomenon of flashbacks and nightmares and agonizing body sensations and volatility in our emotional reactions. All of these things and more, if our stress is not resolved, will carry on oftentimes and result in these very debilitating kinds of symptoms that people experience. And they live their lives as if the event itself or what happened as a result of the event is still living on. I think that's a hard thing to wrap our heads around if we haven't had that experience. But I think it's really important to remember because our minds are constantly trying to protect us. Our brains are trying to protect us. And they do that, but there are times when they can't do that fully. So just to say a little bit more about the human stress response, I think we all recognize that when we have positive stress, negative stress, that it's not uncommon for us to feel it in our stomachs, in our muscles, in our lungs, in our eyes, our skin, our bowel movements might change, particularly if this is sort of continues more than just a few moments, right? But even in a few moments, we know that if you witness a car accident or something like that, all of these things come into being oftentimes. And so again, what's happening is the brain sees what's out there and begins to release these stress hormones, if you will, to tell our bodies to prepare for whatever it is that's coming at us that we need to be concerned about. Now, there is a book that I want to recommend to you, and I'll put a picture of it here, that is very much in keeping with what we're talking about here. And this is a book called The Body Keeps the Score. Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen it, read it. Bessel van der Kolk is a psychiatrist who authored it and takes the kind of collective research work and also clinical work that he and others have done. And I think in this book really compiles it in a really helpful way. The book is written in a way that's very readable. It's not highly, esoteric. But he talks about brains, but he tells a lot of narratives, and it's a book I think I would highly recommend to you if you're interested in reading it. But again, I'll keep coming back to that theme that the body keeps the score. That yes, trauma has an impact on us in all of our biopsychosocial, spiritual, communal ways, and it starts with the body. Which is one reason why, we want to focus on doing breathing exercises and yoga and stretching and doing things that help our bodies maintain some sense of calm. So what are we talking about here? Well, these are some definitions. It's overwhelming demands that are placed upon the physiological, upon the body, that result in a profound sense of vulnerability, fear, and a loss of control. My guess is we've all had events, at least in our lives, where we felt that, at least temporarily. It's all felt overwhelming. And we know that when we experience something like that, our body is putting into full action its attempts to protect us. And our minds, our thinking brains, in some ways are really shut down, or not entirely maybe, but it's much harder for us to speak, to make decisions, that kind of thing. And so, again, overwhelm is a key part of this. Traumatic events, as Judith Lewis Herman says, that overwhelm ordinary systems of care. And here she references the importance of that sense of control, connection, and meaning. So I just want to focus there for a minute and ask you to think about if, in fact, trauma impacts a sense of control and connection and meaning, what comes to your mind as we begin to anticipate what it means to be trauma informed? What kinds of things do we want to do? Do we want to support, foster, that would point us in the direction of responding to this loss of connection, of control, connection, and meaning? And I'd love for you to put a few ideas in the chat box if you would. If you want to help people regain control and connection and meaning, what might you do to help make that happen, or to encourage that? And I'm thinking here in very concrete terms. It can be little things, right? So choices, absolutely. When we listen well to people, we're already giving control. When we invite them to choose the direction they want, or maybe we might provide some options from which they can choose. We want to also help people seek out people who are supportive and provide positive relationships for them. Hopefully you and I are one of those relationships, but we don't want to be the only one. So we can help them think about who are the people in your life who have your back and who are going to stand up for you, and who treat you as if you are somebody who matters, right? And any way to help people feel empowered, Katie says, to care for themselves. Because in the long run, that sense of control has to be coming from inside. And I'll just say, as an aside, I will be doing something on motivational interviewing tomorrow with all of you. And when we think about motivational interviewing, what we're really doing is helping people tap into that internal sense of motivation, control, if you will, to choose their own path. So being patient, listening well, understanding that people cope differently. Yes, Hazel, thank you. Really good observation. And how to know how to understand, how to speak with people who are experiencing these symptoms. and don't make them feel weird. That's beautiful. Exactly. Just help people feel accepted, uh, to honor their uniqueness, honor who they are, and recognize that we're all a little weird sometimes, but weird is an okay thing. But we don't want to make them feel weird. And then Stanton, you talk about helping people identify their strengths. What are people good at? What are they capable of? What have they done when they've been more in control, been more connected? And so that's a really important piece of this strengths-based and trauma-informed approach. Kristen talks about when listening to a story, allow them to process feelings and model sitting with their hurt. Yeah. Create a safe space. And I love what you're saying there, Kristen. And I know I talk about it in terms of the term compassion, of this idea of entering into people's suffering and walking alongside them in it without trying to fix it, without trying to make it all go away. Somehow just being in solidarity and honoring the fact that people are choosing to share with you, and also honoring the fact that it is for them to process their own feelings. We can't process them for them. And we certainly don't want to distract them or try to pretend like it's not a big deal or make it all better. Yeah, nice, nice. So what makes an experience traumatic? Well, there are several factors. One is that there's a threat, and whether or not it's a real threat or perceived threat makes no difference. It's still a threat. And so it's going to be something that um, is either a threat to their own physical safety and or emotional sense of well-being. It's also something that has overwhelm. It's well beyond the normal kind of stressors we live with, and it takes all of our attention. There are intense feelings of fear and lack of control that come through in this, because all of a sudden you are not what you thought you were in control of your life, right? And then a sense of helplessness can ensue, and people begin to actually perceive themselves, others around them, and the world in different ways. And we'll be doing a little exercise around that in a bit. One of the things that, going back to some of Bessel van der Kolk's work, and you'll notice I'm throwing in a lot of quotes here because I think they're really helpful. But one of the things to think about when you're encountering people, in your reaching out to people, having conversations with them about change or about resources, recognizing that if people feel kind of skittish and on edge, or they're not listening well, that can be attributable to a lot of things, but it might just mean that they are continuing to organize their lives as if the trauma were still going on. And what this means is they're waiting for the next shoe to drop, or they're waiting for something bad to happen. And so they get caught up in what we might call negativity, right? Or being pessimistic about life, or being hopeless even. And we hear that, and of course we want them to be more hopeful, and we try to instill hope. But we need to recognize that even at a very physiological level, people are experiencing the need to protect themselves and be safe. And when you're protecting yourself and trying to always gain safety, it's really hard to think creatively about problem solving, about planning, and those kinds of things. Kind of saying the same thing. Long after the actual event has passed, the brain keeps sending signals to the body to escape something that no longer exists. Now, another aspect of all of this, in terms of the impact of trauma, is that it almost invariably involves not being seen, not being mirrored, and not being taken into account. I don't know what this brings up for you, but when I think about not being seen, I think about a lot of people who are marginalized. Sometimes it's related to homelessness, sometimes it's related to that and the color of their skin or the way they act or their sexuality, or it might be related to gender, it might be related to all manner of things. But when people are traumatized, it means that the trauma, particularly if it's interpersonal trauma, has happened with someone who has objectified them and not taken them in serious account as a person, but as an object more. And so they're not truly seen for who they are. They're not truly being mirrored. In this case, we're talking about this idea that when we are connected with people, we feel like we're in synchronicity with them. And that synchronicity results from this nonverbal and verbal kind of back and forth of mirroring, which is how we learn. We might call it mimicry even, but the way we learn is we're copycats, right? We hear something and we try it on for size, and then other people hear us say something and they try it on for size. I mean, this is what happens in young children acquiring language, right? And this mirroring is so critically important because it does create this sense of being in sync with somebody else and being connected with somebody. But in trauma, there's a disconnect in that. And then in trauma also, people don't feel like they're believed, taken seriously, that their opinions matter, that kind of thing. So I want to show you a video here, and I bet that you've all seen this video. And I bet if you've already seen it, you'd love to see it again. This video went viral maybe a year ago now. And if you haven't seen it, it's fine. But I'm going to show it to you. But I'm going to show it to you twice. And I'm going to show it to you the first time. And I'm not going to show, there won't be any sound. I'd like you just to observe. But this is the very opposite portrayal of trauma. This is the portrayal of what it means, in this case, for this father and son, to have a sense of the son being taken into account, being mirrored, being believed, being taken seriously, being seen, all of these things. And it's a phenomenal video. And it's one example, but I think, you know, it's important for us to keep in mind that the building blocks of being healthy, whole people are really located in being seen and seeing others. And so this obviously is apropos for our work that we do, right? When we truly see others for who they are and we listen well to them and we see their strengths as well as their deficits. When we mirror, when we find that sense of synchronicity, when we take them into account. So let's watch this. No sound, but I'd love for you just to observe the communication happening, which is such a beautiful thing, I believe, between these two people in terms of being seen, heard, taken into account, and mirrored. Here we go.
Excuse me, I'm not hearing the sound on this video.
All right. What I don't know what your observations are, but I just think it's absolutely fascinating to watch this interchange between these two human beings that are very different places in life. And so I'm now going to show it with the sound. And what you'll notice is the language itself is something that is different than our usual conversations because the young boy, the toddler, hasn't yet acquired language, right? But there's a language, there's a communication that's happening. And partly what's reasoning happening here, and I'm going to tie this to motivational interviewing and reflective listening, is the dad is carrying on the conversation with the kid and making his best guesses about what the kid is thinking, saying, doing, feeling, and putting them out there. And so the communication, of course, isn't happening at the verbal level. It's kind of pre-verbal, if you will, or at least in terms of language and meaning. But it is something that there's still communication going. And this is what I mean by mirroring. So let's listen to it now with the sound just to have take another example.
Okay. They need to work on that, right? Yes. Okay. Did you understand it though? No. Okay. All right. Huh? Oh, no, not this one. This is the grand finale of this. Yeah, that's the last one. That's what I was wondering. I don't know what they're gonna do next season because they did some stuff this time. Exactly what I was thinking. Oh yeah. Right. Don't bring that again. You know what I'm saying? Don't do the same stuff. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I was thinking that. Yeah. Yeah. Like go somewhere else with that, but don't bring it here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. That's what I said. And then it was like, you know what I'm saying? And I was like, what in the world? But don't do it here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Really? I thought the same thing. We think a lot alike, huh? Oh, that's crazy. Right.
So as you've all noted here in the chat box, Dad is making extra effort to really listen well, to make eye contact, to use his body to mirror the baby's body language. And there's a certain lightness of being around it, you know, that's a kid who feels safe, right? Who feels like he can be outgoing and make jokes with his dad, if you will. I don't try to spend much time doing this, but I do sometimes imagine what a video would look like if it were just the opposite. And oftentimes it would be a kid sitting in front of a TV by himself in this case, and being told to be quiet if he was making noises. We can all imagine what that might be like, but you can imagine the shaping that takes place as a result of this kind of caregiving versus what others might have been seen, and even worse if they might have experienced significant trauma and intrusive trauma even. So thank you for watching that. In short, what's happening is we're experiencing a loss of connection to our own selves, understanding ourselves, to our bodies, our families, others in the world. And it is something that often happens slowly over time that in that sense isn't recognizable except when we take slices of time and take a look at it. Any other comments, thoughts? Again, I think, you know, as I wait for that, all of this points us to what it might mean to be trauma informed. And even based on this quote here, how can we help people to know themselves better? How can they learn to describe and understand their own feelings about things, their own thoughts, and have that recognized and honored? How can people recognize what's happening in their own bodies? We find that people who are traumatized oftentimes are very much out of touch with their own bodies, the functions of the body, but also when they're hungry, when they have to go to the bathroom, when all of these things get out of sync oftentimes. And then families and chosen or not families, people who are close to them and to the world in general. All right. Where does this all come from? Well, it can come from lots of places. And of course, there are so-called natural human-made disasters, flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes, fires. It also comes from human events, all manner of human events. Certainly the ones that we're experiencing right now, we could point to as in terms of the COVID, the violence taking place in the world, school shootings, witnessing suicides, or suicides in general, poverty, homelessness, all of these things, accidents and more. And then there's interpersonal violence that happens. And of course, most of interpersonal violence in our country actually happens within a home or within close relatives. Probably 80 to 90% of interpersonal violence happens somehow within people with close proximity. And then there's insidious trauma. And here I'm talking more about kind of the so-called under the surface trauma that's always there, kind of like a drumbeat, but you don't pay attention to it. And here, you know, sometimes we talk about microaggressions, and there's nothing micro about their impact, but they are seen as kind of small things, like being followed in a store because people suspect you're going to steal something, or maybe people crossing the street when you come. And people of color, of course, experience this all the time, particularly Black people who have been sort of in our culture, we've been sort of conditioned to see people as dangerous, especially Black males. So there's insidious trauma that happens. There's gaslighting. There's everyday verbal, nonverbal slights that people experience. And then there's this historical, intergenerational, system-induced trauma, which is very much in existence. And you know, sometimes it's said that our systems of, even our caring systems, our social service systems, often are, in part at least, developed to keep people out as much as they are to keep people in. And oftentimes people are not able to engage in services and have fears of systems that have in the past traumatized. And a whole lot more we could say about this, but this is real, and it's a real thing. So let me just pause there and just see what thoughts, comment, and questions maybe you have. You're all welcome. I believe you're capable of unmuting yourself and just speaking aloud, and I welcome that. But any comments or thoughts anybody wants to add to any of this at this point? Katie says, it seems through these definitions that trauma is not only the event, but how the event is dealt with after it happens. That's absolutely right. In fact, some people will say it's really not the event that's traumatizing, because people will respond to a singular event in many, many different ways, depending on where they're coming from, what angle they have, but also what their protective factors are coming into the situation, what kind of support they have, how they view the world. All of those things play into it. So what's really traumatizing is, in fact, the response to it. And so that's a really important distinction to make. Thank you for that. We can also talk about acute trauma from a one-time event, which can in of itself be incredibly debilitating. Sexual violence, for instance, or physical violence, but also accidents and things like that. So trauma, a one-time event trauma can have a long-lasting impact, but not always. Chronic trauma relates more to the kind of the impact that happens when events pile upon each other. During Katrina and other hurricane events that have happened, especially, but I'm particularly thinking of that, where people who were living in New Orleans, for example, the trauma was in part the hurricane coming through. That was kind of a causal feature, but the real trauma was having to lose one's home, to get out of there, to maybe leave pets behind, to ultimately potentially have their belongings, their property destroyed, and then having to move to a new city and having to start over again, having to make new friends, having to get jobs, and then on top of that, the anxiety that comes with that, and the fear, and maybe they begin to drink more or use opiates, or maybe, I mean, who knows? But it's just this cycle, this ongoing churning of traumatic events that sometimes creates this chronic sense of trauma that people are experiencing. And then we can talk about what's variously called developmental or complex trauma. And here we are talking about, generally speaking, that kind of trauma that is a chronic, has a chronic impact, but it's often related again to those early childhood experiences. And we'll talk a bit about the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, that has brought this to light. So I want to say a little bit more about this developmental or complex trauma. And I think what I'll do to start that conversation off is to ask you to listen to a passage from a book, from Bessel van der Kolk's book on The Body Keeps the Score. And this is a description that it's hard to listen to, actually, and I want to just forewarn you about that. But it's a description of a 2.5-year-old who is brought to a trauma center and is seen because of some of his acting out behavior. So I'm going to read this verbatim from Bessel van der Kolk's book. Anthony was only 2.5 when he was referred to our trauma center by a child care center because its employees could not manage his constant biting and pushing, his refusal to take naps, and his intractable crying, headbanging, and rocking. He did not feel safe with any staff member and fluctuated between despondent collapse and angry defiance. When we met with him and his mother, he anxiously clung to her, hiding his face while she kept saying, "Don't be such a baby." He startled when a door banged somewhere down the corridor and then burrowed deeper into his mom's lap. When she pushed him away, he sat in a corner and started to bang his head. "He just does that to bug me," his mother remarked. When we asked about her own background, she told us that she'd been abandoned by her parents and raised by a series of relatives who hit her, ignored her, and started to sexually abuse her at the age of 13. She'd become pregnant by a drunken boyfriend who left her, and when she told him she was carrying his child. Anthony was just like his father, she said, a good for nothing. She had had numerous violent rows with subsequent boyfriends, but she was sure that this had happened too late at night for Anthony to notice. If Anthony were admitted to a hospital, he would likely be diagnosed with a host of different psychiatric disorders: depression, oppositional defiant disorder, anxiety, reactive attachment disorder, ADHD, and PTSD. None of these diagnoses, however, would clarify what was wrong with Anthony, that he was scared to death and fighting for his life, and he did not trust that his mother could help him. I know when I first read this passage, I started getting very irritated with the mother when I was reading her responses to her child. And then all of a sudden, I start hearing about the mom's background. And one of the things we know about trauma is that trauma that's not transformed is transmitted. And so here we have, I think, a good example of a mom who has had a horrendous life herself, and she's doing the best she can. And now she has this child. And I would say she's doing the best she can with raising this child, but she is so overwhelmed and overcome by her own needs and reactions that she's really not able to respond to him in the way that we would hope she could as a healthier parent, right? And this is a dangerous situation. It's an unsafe situation for Anthony, of course. And this would be a situation where likely Child Protective Services would, we'd want to be brought in potentially to assess the situation further, or at least to have maybe before that to give her a chance to really get the services she might need for the two of them. But that said, I offer that as one example of far too many examples that are out there in real life of people for whom that is their backstory. And so it's not surprising that the behaviors we see, the attitudes, the view of the world that people bring forward is what it is. Looking here at the chat box, Stanton says, with people living longer, I can't help but wonder, can complex traumas sometimes have their onset later in life? You know, I think, just to respond to that, I think there is a kind of a complex trauma that can happen at any time. I think definitionally, particularly when we use the term developmental trauma, we're often hearkening back to those 0 to 18 years, just because we know that that's a particular time when our brains are forming, our bodies are forming, our attitudes are forming. Not that they can't be transformed themselves, but there is sort of almost a baked into the brain kind of response that happens when these things happen before people are able to sort of have a broader sense of consciousness. But I think you're right, Stanton. I think, yeah, I mean, I think even of elderly people, maybe they live their lives quite satisfactorily, but then there's elder abuse maybe, or there's neglect, or there's, all these things. So I think, we don't want the definitions to get in the way. That the point being is that absolutely there is significant trauma that people can experience later in life. So thank you for offering that. So there are a lot of metaphors we could use for trauma. One of them is it's a thief. And just invite you in the chat box. Actually, let's try something here a little different. Don't put anything in the chat box yet. Let's do a chat storm, okay? I'm asking you just to think for a few 30 seconds or so. Think to yourself, what are some things that get stolen when this is the experience like Anthony had? What's stolen from Anthony? And then I'm going to go ahead and ask you to hold your thoughts, but get your fingers ready. And then I'll just count down 3, 2, 1, and then just ask you all at one time to give us a good blast of all the things that get stolen, just to try something different here. Okay. So let's just take 30 seconds of silence just to think about all the different things, and then maybe just write 2 or 3 things that get stolen, 1, 2, or 3 things that get stolen when I signal, please. You're all listening very well. Nobody has typed anything yet. That's great. All right, go ahead and type something and send if you would now. 3, 2, 1. Yeah. Hope, joy, trust, innocence, time, self-worth, feeling loved, valued, a sense of security, laughter, yeah, lightness of being, comfort, feeling comforted, sense of feeling hopeful, and being able to attend to things and focus is often robbed as a result. Happiness, healthy dreams, all of this and more, sense of peace, yeah. And so that's the bad news, right? And we will be getting to some better news, but again, I think we have to recognize how impactful all of this is. And so these are the things that you've written, and then a few other things as well that are really taken from people. And so this basic sense of dignity and respect, and a sense of being able to regulate our emotions, believing in the goodness of ourselves and others. This idea of even making it easier to be a problem solver when your brain is able to be freed up to think in creative problem solving ways. And then there's health protective factors that we're going to talk about more, but it turns out that living under this incredible stress, this traumatic stress, actually impacts people's lives, their likelihood to experience different chronic conditions and diseases, as well as their longevity. And so overall well-being is absolutely impacted. Trauma has been described by many as the #1 public health problem in our country. Now, one could argue that perhaps, but it's something that is absolutely there that needs to be addressed. So again, just for a little bit of thinking and audience participation, if you think about somebody like an Anthony who grows up maybe but really hasn't gotten a lot of help. I mean, he's getting along, but he still has a lot of unresolved issues. What do you imagine Anthony or anyone else might say to finish this sentence stem? The world is, and just type in a word or a phrase that comes to mind. The world is what? From it's dark, yeah, dangerous, cruel, against me, out to get you. The world is crazy, it's out of control, it's chaotic, the world is unsafe, pointless, yeah, none of it matters, it's absolutely unfair, unjust, scary. Yeah, how about this? They always think that I am what? Or am unpredictable maybe, or the world's unpredictable, yeah. They always think that I am wrong, I'm to blame, I'm not trying, I'm not I'm not wanting the best for things, I'm not optimistic, I'm stupid, I can't think, I can't problem solve, I'm not worthy. They always think that all manner of things, mostly negative, a good for nothing, yeah. I will never be good enough. Yeah. I will never be loved, cared for, held safely in someone else's arms. Be content, yeah, happy, worth, accepted. So, employed, absolutely. I will never have close connections with people. I'll never experience sort of that deeper joy. I am, and this gets old, I know, but this idea that it just gets steeped within us is I'm unworthy, I'm unacceptable, I'm undeserving even. And I know in my own work in homelessness, I've often thought that some people for whom we wanted to help them acquire housing, for example, or other services, the biggest stumbling block often was some feeling of unworthiness or undeservingness of even being provided with that resource or that service, which is deeply held within one's psyche, right? Now, here's something a little different. If they really cared, and you know who they is, if they really cared, they would, what would they do? If they really cared about me. Thank you for leading with listening. Yeah, they would listen in a particularly careful kind of way in terms of trying to understand the deeper held hopes and values as well as the hurts, right? And they would believe me. They would believe in me. They would pay attention. They would mirror me, right? They'd take me seriously. They'd let me be me. I love that. Yeah. Yeah, they wouldn't try to get me to be somebody else, but they would work with me where I am. And they would help. Yeah, they would find ways to help. Yeah. And Maria, so importantly, they would refrain from judging me, from criticizing me, and accept me for who I am. And that doesn't mean agree with me or agree with what I'm doing. It means they would accept that I am who I am, where I am, doing what I am, just because part of that underlying belief is that people are trying to do the best they can, I believe, to get by in the world, even if the things they're trying to do and the methods you're using are less than helpful to them. And so all of these things, of course, point us once again to what it means to be trauma informed, to refrain from being judgmental. I've never met anybody who's non-judgmental, including myself for sure. So I try to use language around at least restraining or kind of putting to the side for at least the time being judgmental. But I do think while we can't do these things perfectly, we can treat people in as open, accepting way as possible. So I'm gonna just take a few more moments and then we're gonna actually take a break. But I wanted to say a few words about these terms of grief, guilt, and shame. And each of these, of course, they're related, but they also have some nuance and somewhat different. And I know Brene Brown has talked a lot about these things, but grief, guilt, and shame are very much part of the experience of trauma, of ongoing trauma. And the distinctions that I think are helpful are to think about grief as I'm feeling badly about a loss, about not being able to connect with somebody, about not being able to achieve my dreams, or I feel badly about what I did or about what happened, right? Not what I did, but what happened, the death of a friend, the loss of a relationship. And grief is part of our lives and ought to be, because we experience losses all the time. And there's a healthy grieving process that we can all point to. Guilt is also a good thing, particularly if you're recognizing that you did something bad and you need to make recompense for that you need to make it right, if it leads to that. But guilt in and of itself, good guilt, is when we recognize our responsibility. Shame is something different, and shame is I am bad. And it often comes from deep grief and deep guilt, but it begins to morph into something that is not healthy, because it begins to paint the entire picture of ourselves as unworthy, undeserving, and as being bad. And this kind of shame, I think, is often at play, and it's something we really don't necessarily talk with people about, and maybe it's not always possible, but it's something I think we need to keep in the backs of our minds, that shame, when we encounter people and we hear a reluctance to get medical care or behavioral health care or to obtain certain services, it may well be that what's really kind of affecting that is this deep sense of shame, of not feeling even worthy of being provided with those things. Something to consider. All right, with that, I'm going to propose we take a break. It is 10:11, and so let's come back at 19. How's that? 1019 for a nice round number. And I'll type that in the chat box. Please take some time to take a brief break, stretch, move, and then I'll see you back in about 7-8 minutes. All right, welcome back, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. All right. Again, just reminders to do what you need to do to self-regulate, to continue to keep yourself engaged, but also not overwhelmed. So we're going to talk a bit about the brain. I'm not a brain scientist. We don't learn to do that in social work school. So I'm not going to be showing you lots of slices of brains and brain scans and that kind of thing. But what I do want to do is just emphasize how important our brain is to us and how its trauma impacts the brain. So I think one way to start out is to show you a video, which I think does a really nice job of kind of helping us understand trauma in the brain. This particular video made in Australia was also made in the context of a substance use treatment program. And at the very end, there's a correlation made between how the strong kind of presence of trauma has a strong correlation to people picking up and using various kinds of substances, which I think makes perfect sense when you think about the kind of pain and hurt that comes with trauma. Of course, we find ways to ease that hurt and that pain. So let's take a listen here.
The brain develops from the bottom up. The first thing to develop is the brainstem, or the reptilian brain as some people might call it. This area is responsible for our bodily functions. It tells us when to regulate our temperature, when to sleep, and when to eat. The next important part of our brains to develop is the limbic system, or what some people might call the mammalian part of the brain. The limbic system supports a variety of functions including emotion, behavior, motivation, and long-term memory. The next part of the brain to develop is the cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain. This is sometimes considered the human part because humans are one of the only mammals that develop this part of the brain. This part of the brain is responsible for how we as humans were able to develop language, have thoughts, self-awareness, perception, and consciousness. Also, the cortex plays a key role in integrating the central nervous system and functions of memory. The last and most advanced part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is considered the executive functioning part of the brain. For some people, this is the cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain. This is sometimes considered the human part because humans are one of the only mammals that develop this part of the brain. This part of the brain is responsible for how we as humans were able to develop language, have thoughts, self-awareness, perception, and consciousness. Also, the cortex plays a key role in integrating the central nervous system and functions of memory. The last and most advanced part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is considered the executive functioning part of the brain. For some people, this part doesn't fully develop until they're in their mid to late 20s. The prefrontal cortex helps us to think through cause and effect, the ability to plan for the future, set goals, and understand the consequences of our actions. It's also responsible for the ability to moderate social behavior. When we're in a stressful situation, part of our limbic system called the amygdala sets off an alarm bell response to let us know we're in danger and we need to do something about it. When this happens, the brain floods with a hormone called cortisol, so the body knows that something needs to be done. The most common responses to a stressful or dangerous situation are some you might be familiar with: fight, flight, freeze, or submit. This is an inbuilt system of survival to keep us safe when we're in danger. Like when our ancestors might have had to decide whether to stand their ground and fight against a large predator or run away. A stress response is a healthy, normal part of being a human. It lets us know that our bodies are working and keeping us safe. If a person is exposed to a highly stressful or traumatic event, or they have continual exposure to stressful events, like abuse or neglect, their alarm system might become overactive. It might be always switched on, as if there was a risk of danger or threat at all times. For a child, this might affect how their brain develops. This is especially the case if it's in the context of stress or trauma events by a primary caregiver. In these cases, the child might develop an understanding of the world as an unsafe and dangerous place, even when they are in a safe situation. Sometimes this is called hypervigilance. It means being on edge or aware of danger at all times. Being exposed to stressful and traumatic events on a regular basis can also have a significant impact on neural connections in the memory center. It can even change the way we remember actual events. People use alcohol and other drugs for a variety of reasons. When someone's experienced trauma, they might be in a constant state of fight or flight, and so might use substances to help move them out of their stress response state. We also know that substance use can affect the way that our brain functions. Chemicals from substances cross the blood-brain barrier and can either stimulate or depress different parts of the central nervous system, affecting how the person feels, thinks, and acts. Similar to cortisol flooding the brain in the stress response, chemicals from alcohol and other drugs can also affect neural pathways and the way the person might make decisions or remember events. Luckily, neural pathways have the lifelong ability to form and change. You might have heard this referred to as neural plasticity. Through developing a better understanding of the brain and the way trauma and alcohol and other drugs affect neural pathways, clients can be better informed and empowered. This is an intervention itself called psychoeducation.
All right. So that's quite a lot of information about the brain packed into a few minutes. I'm wondering if anyone in the chat box has any comments, thoughts. Some of you probably are quite familiar with brain function, I'm guessing. Others of you not so much, but anyone at all? Anyone comments, questions, thoughts about the interaction between trauma and the brain? And feel free to unmute if you wish. Well, let me just say a little bit about the fight, flight, freeze, submit options that were sort of pointed out there. Of those, of the fight, flight, freeze, and I'll put submit kind of with freeze, although it's a little bit different. But what are some examples that you see in your daily work, practice, or in life in general, of people who might engage in fighting back against something that's happening? What does that look like in your work setting? Thanks, Gail, for your comment about the brain being part of that hormone regulating system. Absolutely, yeah. Which have a lot of influence. Hormones have a lot of influence on our behaviors, yeah. So what are some examples of fights that you might observe in others, maybe in yourself as well, but you don't have to reveal that. But when somebody's starting to tell their story and then they stop and they start feeling extreme emotions, yeah, they might in that case be fighting their own emotions that are coming up. Saying no to offers of help, yeah. Even though that help might be really helpful to them, they might just have an automatic response because they're not willing to, for whatever reasons, to accept that help. Fighting might also look like constantly looking at what's negative, resistance to suggestions. It might even be stronger than that. It might be getting argumentative and even pushing back against ideas in a way that feels really harsh and even somewhat violent. Tone policing might be a form of fighting back. Yeah, can be. What else? Sometimes when we hear things like, you don't understand me, you've never lived my life, or you're only in this job to make money, you don't really care about people. Those are the kinds of things sometimes we hear back from people when they don't take our best intentions at heart, right? Or maybe you think you're better than me. Yep, yep. All of those kinds of edgy pushback kinds of things that feel like blame to us are often ways that people fight back. What about flight? What does fleeing sound like? And of course, it might be literally people getting up out of the chairs and fleeing, but what are the other forms that flight takes in our relationships with people? So silence, yeah, oftentimes, and not a healthy silence or thoughtful silence, but this kind of sort of not being wanting to talk further because there's this kind of going away, right? Avoidance, redirecting things, moving to other things, canceling, not showing up might be other kind of flight patterns. Yeah, yeah. Putting up a false front. Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. All of those things are kind of flight. How about the freeze? What might freeze look like in your work context? Freezing or even submitting. Again, silence might be part of that. Stuck, not responding, flat affect, just kind of dissociating from the situation, right? Being very, very quiet. Sometimes people just not engaging in even the basic interactive aspects of eye contact and back and forth, being evasive, head down. Yeah, all of these things could be. They're not necessarily indicators necessarily, but they all could be. And of course, we might have a combination of fight, flight, freeze things taking place. Certainly, as you can imagine, if we're able to fight back in a situation or we're able to run away, we use our bodies to do that oftentimes. And so we activate our bodies in a way that is actually releasing. Whereas in a freeze response or a submit response, we're not able to do that. And so especially with young kids who are in a situation where they can't escape, they can't fight back, that freezing in place, almost like playing dead, like an opossum, is oftentimes what they are forced to do to survive. And it also turns out that that can be the most debilitating in terms of longer term recovery pieces that people who freeze are having to unpack that. But sometimes it's the only way to survive. And yes, inability to process information being offered is often part of that freeze, brain freeze, if you will, almost. So thank you for that. Yeah. Our brains are sculpted by our early experiences, and the most important job of the brain is to ensure our survival, even under very miserable conditions. And so what happens is neurons that fire together do wire together. And so if you are raised as this young boy with his father to feel safe and loved, you're likely wired for play and exploration. That is, there are neural pathways in your brain that will light up because you are thinking creatively and you have a lightness of being and you're not feeling threatened. And so that creates a sense of good, not only good problem solving, but thinking very creatively. On the other hand, if those neural pathways have been shut down or there's a preponderance of neural pathways that are there trying to protect you, you will become likely wired to manage constantly feelings of being fearful and abandonment and of feeling afraid and frightened. And so that's a whole nother way of being in the world. So again, we have these fight, flight, face, or freeze. And face, of course, in this case, is the one response that we would hope could happen, especially if you have good support and good protective factors, that within a relatively brief amount of time, you'd be able to recognize the symptoms of what's going on when you are tempted to be in fight, flight, freeze mode. But facing something outwardly is a way of actually being able to engage with it, look it in the eye, if you will, and to be able to acknowledge what has happened and hopefully then continue to heal. So part of the healing centered care that we offer, the trauma informed care that we offer, is helping to name the trauma that has happened. That doesn't mean going into the depths of the trauma and all the sights and sounds. That can be actually re-traumatizing unless it's done in the hands of a capable therapist. But when we can name something and take it out of its secretive state and acknowledge that it has happened and it happens to a lot of people, that often becomes the first steps towards people beginning to see it as something more out there rather than something that is so inward. Kate asks, is there hope to help people rewire if they've experienced early trauma? And that's where the good news lies. It absolutely is. And so we know that our brains do have this neural plasticity, right? And so when we are able, we can help people sort of create new wiring or new neural pathways or open up pathways. And the thing that's essentially what trauma-informed care is we're not doing that with that in mind, but we're doing all those kinds of things to bring experiences to people that will help stoke, if you will, some of those pathways that show creative, that help people be more creative, have more wonder, have a greater sense of appreciation, gratitude, help them connect with people who are healthier people to connect with and experience the true joys of friendship, relationship, to help people eat and sleep better and regulate their emotions. So Katie, good timing, because you're actually bringing us into this phase where we're going to start pointing further in that direction. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this image or know what this is referring to. Anybody want to take a wild guess what this is? A particular form of pottery. It's a Japanese form of pottery. Anybody familiar with it or know what it's called? You get extra points, of course, if you can. That said, this is often referred to as kintsukuroi. There are different variations on the word, but what I'm pointing to here is a Japanese art of mending pottery that takes things that are broken apart and using gold and silver lacquer mends them back together again. And I think this is one metaphor that we can use to think about this idea of rewiring, Katie, that you're referring to. We can help people regain a sense of balance in their lives, regain a sense of both safety and happiness and joy. We can help people put their lives back together again. And it's a process, it's a recovery process. It can be a lengthy process. It's an incomplete process sometimes, but it can in fact be something that people can and do engage in. I think we've all experienced a remending or a mending in our own lives, whether that's been something that happened that no longer now is something that is in our memory bank all the time. But we experience this mending process all the time. When it becomes this early childhood trauma that's kind of becomes almost intractable and it kind of is baked into the whole way of our seeing the world and being in the world, then it takes time to relearn new things. And so, but that's really what we're looking at here in trauma-informed approaches. There's a quote from a book by Gregory Boyle called Tattoos on the Heart that I think sums up also the kind of approach that we need to take to be trauma-informed. And that is to say that the compassion that we seek when we're seeing people, working with people, is that which stands in awe at what they have to carry rather than standing in judgment about how they carry it. So a lot of the time, our trauma-informed approaches have more to do with how we are with people, our attitudes towards them, how we view them, because when we view them through a particular lens that is more strengths-based, that does see them as in recovery, that does see them as capable, that believes in them and the possibilities of their lives, then they begin to borrow that belief. And that in and of itself begins to open up some of this rewiring that we're talking about. Now, I did say I wanted to talk a little bit about prevalence of trauma, so I'm going to bounce back a little bit here, but I'm trying to keep these markers along the way that show that recovery is possible. But I did want to point you toward the ACE study. I don't know how many of you might be familiar with this, but this was a study that was done in the 1990s. This is small print here, but really it was a very simple questionnaire that asked 10 different questions about the occurrence of various traumatic events in people's lives, that they were asked as adults to look back and think back to ages 0 to 18 to see if they had had any of these experiences. And so you can see, if you can read the fine print, it relates to people swearing, insulting, putting you down, humiliating you, pushing, grabbing, slapping, touching, fondling, in sexual ways, of feeling like you didn't belong, that you were somebody who sort of mattered, was taken into account. Did you have enough to eat? Did you have clean clothes? Did you have a safe place to work? Did divorce or separation happen between caretakers, parents? Was there abuse that you witnessed? Was there significant substance misuse happening? Was there various forms of mental illness? And so was there someone incarcerated as well? And so these are really sort of big picture, kind of rough markers, if you will. But even so, in doing this study, it was very interesting what the results were. And this was actually done with kind of middle-class folks who were Kaiser Permanente members. They were mostly white, mostly in their 50s. 75% had college degrees. They all had good jobs, good healthcare. So this is obviously a subset of people who we wouldn't necessarily think would likely be people who have experienced a great deal of trauma in their lives. They seemingly are, quote unquote, successful. And yet what we learned, and again, these are the questions asked, and I should say, before I talk about what we learned, about what's missing from that list, that at the time in the 90s was being seen, because it was only looking at trauma that happened within the household, basically. But what do you imagine are some things that we might want to ask about today if we were to ask people about trauma experiences? What are some things that would be added to that list, likely, and are being added to studies that are continuing to be ongoing using this ACE study? Anyone at all? What would you put in the chat box as what might be missing from this list? Well, discrimination, absolutely, Garrett, is one of those things that happens in all kinds of ways to all kinds of people. And bullying, electronic bullying, yeah, as well as in-person bullying, but absolutely these days, what's happening online, homelessness, school violence, absolutely, all those kinds of things. And so, yeah, all of these things and more are things that potentially are sources of a great deal of trauma and abuse, right? And so we need to look at interpersonal trauma, but also institutional trauma, systemic trauma, and obviously looking at race and racism and racist policies, and all of these are very much a part of this, including just living in the fear that I think we all experience of the uncertainty of these times is all part of that. So what we learned in broad strokes was that ACEs, those adverse childhood experiences, are much more common than anybody ever thought. I'm not going to linger here a long time, but at least 2/3 of those people had at least one ACE, and then 80% of those with one ACE reported at least an additional one. And so we see, these numbers around emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, and physical neglect. Those are pretty significant numbers when you think about it, especially given the cohort that was studied. And we also learned that the presence of these adverse childhood experiences has a direct effect on, or a correlation to health outcomes later in life. And so again, because of the way the brain is operating, we see changes in the neurology and the building of neural pathways in the brain. We see changes in people's abilities around social, emotional, and cognitive endeavors. We see people adopting health risk behaviors that are really serving as coping mechanisms. Now, this is again a way to be trauma informed, is to look at behaviors that we would normally see as deficit behaviors and see if we can experience them or reframe them as, at least in large part, ways that people are adapting to try to engage in protection and taking care of themselves. And so eating disorders, smoking, substance misuse, self-harm, sexual promiscuity, violence even, are often ways that people are trying to cope and use their best skills that they know how to meet their needs, even though in some cases, many cases, it's actually making things worse. And so just a little bit more about these correlations. If we're talking about adolescent health, we're talking about an increase of teen pregnancy, again, substance misuse, sexual behavior, and so on and so forth. We also know that in adults, we see a higher risk of heart disease and lung disease, liver disease, suicide, HIV, and STDs. And please know, I'm not here saying that if you or anyone you know has these conditions, it doesn't necessarily mean they have had early childhood experience trauma, but it does mean that there's a higher correlation and risk for that occurring. And then we begin to see people when they meet that threshold of maybe 4 adverse childhood experiences, which is not all that uncommon, that then we see a pretty significant jump in the likelihood of alcoholism and other substance misuse. We see a doubling of diagnoses with cancer and emphysema and other conditions as well. I've worked with people in recovery who have had ACE scores of 9 and 10. That's not my own personal story, for which I'm very grateful, but that is to say that even though the risk factors get much, much higher with a higher ACE score, it doesn't mean that recovery is not possible. But we do know that people are more likely to die earlier by as many as 20 years. We've already known that from people experiencing chronic homelessness, that they tend to die on average in their 40s and 50s. You don't see a lot of elderly people who are surviving and who make it on the streets, at least. And suicide, a 30-fold increase in suicide. So you can understand why this is seen as a public health risk, right? That this trauma and its impact. Before I go there, I want to say a few things. And that is that, again, I want to emphasize that just because somebody has one of these conditions doesn't necessarily point directly to trauma, but it's worth our having in the back of our minds, the question, I wonder what this person's life has been like. What has been their experience? What has intervened, if you will, to make it harder for them to live more healthy and full lives? Because I truly believe that at the core of every living human being is a desire to live a life of health, wellness, connection, meaning, giving back even, I think there's a core that's at the core of every human being. But I think what happens is that trauma really beats that down oftentimes, and it covers up those core desires with, I often call it the muck of trauma. And so oftentimes when we meet people, we encounter people, we're seeing what's coming forth as being the trauma reactions rather than the core desires and hopes that people carry. But what I would say to you is that in being trauma informed, we are wanting to tap into those core values and hopes and aspirations that people have. And that's also where motivational interviewing comes in, that we'll talk about tomorrow, really helps us gain the skills and language and attitude set to tap into that. So just very briefly, trauma has an impact on our entire beings. It has an impact on our physical health. It has, and I'm going to go through these very quickly. It has an impact on our abilities to function. And often that hyper arousal and intrusive thoughts and avoidance are indicators of the fight, flight, flee responses that we have. Certainly PTSD has really impacts functioning on our mental health, right? And I'm just going to point to one of these, the next to last one, the borderline personality disorder. For those of you who know that diagnosis and work in mental health settings, what we've come to learn is that there is a high level of predictable early childhood trauma that is often causal, if you will, or at least contributes to the development of these chaotic kinds of ways of seeing the world in this very polarized, hot and cold way. These are the folks who one day think you're the best thing since sliced pudding, and the next day you're fired as their case manager or counselor. It's an unfortunate diagnostic name because it doesn't really describe, and it's an unfortunate because people who are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder are often seen in a very kind of negative way, because their behavior patterns are very challenging for us to work with in a compassionate kind of way. But I think it's important for us to remember that for many of these mental health diagnoses, there is a contributing factor of childhood trauma. Yeah, I'm just looking again at some chat box things. We might ask somebody, as Maria says, how was your childhood? And sometimes kids don't know how to determine or to even identify abuse. So just asking people about, I'm not sure where you're going with this, Maria, but just asking people about their childhood, what was it like, is a good question to start with. But don't expect that people are going to be totally forthcoming with things that they've been holding very close to their own being, have kept secret, have been told to keep it secret. These questions don't always bring to light, the information that might be instructive. And the beauty of being trauma informed is we don't have to know all the gory details of trauma. We just need to know and understand that it has happened, or probably has happened, and probably is a contributing factor to how people view the world and ourselves and how they engage in services, and then go from there. All right, just for those of you who are familiar with the diagnosis of PTSD, will recognize these kinds of different ways that it manifests. Yeah, Gail, thanks for sharing that. I think all of us, many of us have had the experience of knowing people for long periods of time without knowing them in a deeper way. And this was certainly true of many people coming back from World War I and II in particular. Some of us have parents who were in those wars and never talked about their experiences when they came back, because there wasn't permission to do that. There wasn't an invitation. And there certainly was a reluctance due to stigma about doing so, and a fear of what might happen if they begin sharing that, and a lot of shame, I think, also. So we will often have that experience of being with people and not knowing some of the underlying story that's there for them. Again, the shattered spirits and beliefs, and often people who have religious faith believe that God has abandoned them or they're unworthy. This often comes up for them. And then the social distrust and isolation. And of course, during these days and times when we are wanting and desiring to be safe by socially distancing, for some people that just accentuates the sense of loneliness and disconnect that they already have in the world. And so that's another layer of trauma built upon this. And then we need to also acknowledge the communal sense of trauma that happens for people who live in various neighborhoods or cities or states even. And we have to recognize that people who live in very impoverished areas where there's not a lot of resources, where there aren't good grocery stores, where there aren't good educational systems, that environment in and of itself is part of the communal trauma that takes place. And again, just expanding on this, multiple studies have found that levels of violence, crime, and delinquency, education, psychological distress, and various health problems are affected by neighborhood characteristics and conditions, oftentimes which are forced upon people by the way gentrification processes go and the concentration of wealth and power and where resources are allocated. All right, I'm going to stop there with this slide set. I'm also going to just bring myself back into the room. I so appreciate your involvement in this thus far. I will say that the first 2 hours of this presentation are kind of a downer, although I think they're really important, and I really appreciate your hanging in there. I wonder, before we go to another break soon, what's coming up for you at this point? What feelings, what thoughts, what questions? Just if you would, and again, I invite you to do that in the chat box, or feel free to just unmute. But this whole impact of trauma, what are some takeaways even that you might want to share at this point? Kristen, thank you for that. Yeah. The kind of care that you've been provided has helped you take those experiences and transform them into experiences that have made you who you are. And in this case, somebody who I'm assuming is giving back to the community and helping other people heal as a result of the therapies that you've received. Yeah. Yeah, we do have a lot of work to do. And I know that prevention is very much on our thoughts as if only we could prevent these things from happening to kids. And so we have to look at that, right? But we have to look at intervention as well. We have to look at ways to intervene before things get too bad. And so, we do have some systems in place that really attempt to do that. But it turns out that oftentimes, so much of this early childhood trauma happens behind closed doors, and we don't want to get involved oftentimes, even though we might see things that are indicators that something's not right. But I think it really, all of this begs the question of how can we be more proactive in both prevention and intervention efforts as early as possible, so that people's lives aren't so traumatized and so agonizing for them. And Carol says, understanding where trauma comes from makes it easier to be compassionate and forgiving, not take it personally. Yeah, I think that's a huge takeaway for me personally, and hopefully for all of you, is that when we see people, and our first impulse, our own trauma response, is to see them as being dangerous or harsh or bad, or we label people, we do all these things, right? Because we're trying to protect ourselves. But when we can step back and understand that what we're seeing in front of us is often a manifestation of what has come before, and if we can reframe that as this person who looks demanding to us can be seen as somebody who's advocating for themselves in the best way possible, or this person who seems shut down and unwilling to talk with us, it may be that they're just engaging in behavior that is highly protective of them and their own vulnerability. And we recognize that we need to just hang in there with people, but we can't expect too much too soon. When we can do all of that reframing and use a trauma-informed lens, then I think it does make it easier, as you say, Carol, to exercise that compassion that we want to exercise, that acceptance, that forgivingness. It does not mean that we tolerate behaviors in a way that we are traumatized or abused by other people. I want to be real clear about that. We still have to be boundaried, right? We're not asking ourselves to take on the kind of abuse that other people have experienced. But it does mean we have to have certain tolerance and understanding that allows us to, at least to some degree, take that in and recognize it for what it is, so that we can continue meeting people where they are to help them hopefully move beyond that. The prevention piece, as Katie says, of changing community norms is really striking. Yeah, abusive, traumatic behaviors that are so prevalent that are considered normal have to be changed. Wow, what a wonderful statement. I wonder if you or others would kind of maybe give indicators of what you think about as what we currently see as normal behaviors. I'll give one as I'm thinking about it, and this is actually from a piece that I read from the country of Mauritania, where someone talked about, as a 5-year-old, she was sold into sexual slavery, basically, to a shepherd, somebody who was very isolated, living alone, and they were tending large flocks of sheep. But her experience in that country was to be sexually molested and abused by this person night after night after night. And she actually ends up describing that experience as normal because she didn't know anything different. She didn't even know that that was out of the ordinary. And in fact, in Mauritania as a country, to this day, sexual slavery of that kind is sort of taken as normal behavior. And I think things are changing, but she even describes the fact that when her older brother, who had also been sold into sexual slavery in a similar kind of situation, ended up kind of organizing to actually combat it, that when she was even given the offer to leave her master and to get out of there, she initially refused, because for her, she didn't know what was out there. She only knew what she knew. And for her, it was normal. And so that's maybe an extreme and graphic kind of way of seeing this. But so often we do see things as normal when they're indeed not at all. And just now looking, Katie, at your reply, you recently spoke with an elder who described sexual assault of young girls as it's happened to all of us. Get over it. Yeah, as if this is just the way things are. And particularly around sexual assault, I think this is very prominent. But so is all other kinds of violence and neglect, and just the whole attitude set of kids are to be seen, not heard. No, is that it? Or something like that. But we don't take kids seriously, right? We don't pay attention. And the story earlier, Stacey, of that 2.5-year-old, yeah. He would have been diagnosed with multiple issues. And I see that as more normal than looking for causes. That's a really interesting insight and impact. I think you're absolutely right. And in our medicalized systems of care, we want to get the diagnosis right. And of course, diagnoses at some level are convenient fictions, right? I mean, we think they are what they are, but I remember Bessel van der Kolk saying, I heard him talk once, and he said, there is no such thing as PTSD. He said it's a label and it's a constellation of symptoms, but there is no such thing. What is real is the hurt and harm and trauma that's been imposed upon people. And we just use that as a label. So that whole comment, Stacy, bears a whole lot more conversation, I think. And it really is, I think trauma-informed care is really that act of going beyond the labels and assumptions. And I mentioned that with borderline personality too. You know, what does that mean? Well, it means nothing unless we get to know people and understand their own stories and personal experiences. And then we can begin to help people reintegrate their lives with their own understanding of what has happened to them as not being normal, as being harmful. And so when we think about people being dissociated, we want them to reassociate or reconnect or reintegrate their lives so they have a fuller understanding of what has impacted them. And absolutely, just that whole idea of when somebody in some way reveals to you a past trauma, you know, and just whatever. Our response, of course, is many of us, we don't want to open up that can of worms, right? Because we don't want to re-traumatize. That said, we absolutely do want to acknowledge what the person has told us and recognize how harmful that is, and even how it has been a common experience for other people, but it's not normal. It's not how things should be. And in whatever way to help people see that, one, you're taking them seriously, you're believing them, you're not saying, oh, you're making that up, or that's just the way things are, get over it. But it's a way of saying to the person, I see you, I hear you, I take that into account. And I hope beyond that we can say, and there is hope, there is help, there is recovery that is possible. But it is, in fact, in the identifying and naming where we have to start. Yeah, Brittany, I'm with you. If we had better safety nets for paid maternity leave, paternity leave, and affordable qualified childcare. Yeah, we see so much pushback on these things and accusations made, but I absolutely believe those early childhood interventions, even school lunches, right? We know makes a huge impact for people. And after school programs and all of these things. And Stanton, right. Once people know what it's called, that there's a name that's been given to it, it helps them recognize that, oh, I'm not solely alone in this. This isn't just me. This is something that's been identified by others. And that helps us move out of our internal kind of preoccupation to understand that, oh, there's a bigger world. And part of trauma-informed care actually is really opening up people's opportunities to see a bigger world out there. Because trauma itself is isolating, it's secretive, and it's shameful, and so people hang on to it, and it becomes the unspeakable, actually, for so many people. Well, this is, I so appreciate your messaging here in the chat box and your attention. I'd like to suggest we take another break, and it's currently 11:07, and let's go to, oh, what's 8? Oh, now it's 11:08. So let's come back at 11:15, okay? 11:15. And I'll revisit some of your chat box comments as well. All right, take a break, please.
One question. So what time is this, the webinar?
Was that for me or someone else, please?
I think it was somebody else.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
No, he said in the chat, he clarified it was for you. Are you, Ramiro, were you asking what time it ended? It ends at 1.
All right, we'll get started here real soon. I'm wanting to bring up something here. Well, once again, thank you all for your good engagement. I really appreciate your chat box entries. And so as we get started again, I'll just say, just going back a little bit to some of the conversation or in the chat box, I think Maria talks about domestic violence and trauma, especially in the Hispanic community. Sad to admit, but most of the time, they are not allowed to speak or express themselves. Yeah, which is really interesting, isn't it? In that your community is known as a matriarchal community, and yet there's a lot that has to be kept under wraps and not taken seriously. A lot of behind closed doors. Yeah. How to define the wife model to a mental abuse, scared to express themselves. Yeah. So many norms within our society that really put down women who, both subtly and more overtly. We are a very chauvinistic, male-oriented system in terms of our privilege. And of course, there's the white male piece of which I'm a part of that system of privilege and having advantages. All right. What I thought I'd do, I just put into the chat box something that's titled Sarah's Story. And I thought, for the sake of just giving you all an opportunity to talk with each other a little bit for a brief time and allow myself to not be in the limelight all the time. I've asked Stacy here to create breakout rooms that are set for 3 to 4 people. I trust that all of you on here would be willing to go into a breakout room and have a brief discussion. What this is it's a brief, well, open it up and download it if you would right now, if you're able to. Hopefully at least one person in each group will have access to it, because I'll ask you to reference it. But what we're looking here is a narrative of Sarah, and goes into some detail about her life story in 4 paragraphs. And so I'll ask you at the beginning to go ahead and read that together as a group, maybe take turns reading paragraphs or something. But then also go back and then name the various traumatic experiences in Sarah's life, and identify not only maybe the details, not the details, but what happened, but what kind of trauma is that, would you say? And then also please identify the strengths you see in Sarah as she is trying to cope with her life. And then imagining that you were meeting Sarah for the first time, maybe just talk briefly about what are you taking into account? What are you thinking about? Where do you want to start? There's no one way to do this, but how do you create a relational foundation with a Sarah, and what do you want to be aware of? So I know that's kind of a broad kind of scope of questions, and you won't get to all of it probably, but for the next 10 minutes, if you would, I'd appreciate if you would get into these small groups. And then one of you, please step up and take the lead in facilitating the conversation. I'm not necessarily going to ask us to come back and all report in. That would be pretty take a lot of time, but please have this conversation among yourselves. Alicia, I can paste it again. And if you can't see it, maybe somebody else in your group will be able to do so. But it's showing up in the chat box here. Okay. All right, Stacy, please do your thing.
Fantastic. I'm going to open up all of those breakout rooms. I'll shoot a message to everybody when they're going to close, but you'll receive a 30-second warning when I bring everybody back together. Yeah. Let's see. Tiffany and Jennifer, were you guys not assigned?
It said that my meeting had timed out, so it had me sign back in again. I don't know why it did that.
Okay, let me see.
So, yeah, if you can assign Tiffany to elsewhere, and I'm not sure about Jennifer as well. I think I'll stay out of the room.
Okay.
Thank
I was
you.
able to move her and Jennifer. There we go. Well, one of the rooms has only 2 people, but
It's okay, you know. Hopefully they like each other and can talk to each other.
Yeah.
Or even if they don't like each other. Well, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the training.
Yeah, never a happy training to do.
Yeah, but important.
So what is your role there, Stacy?
There's breakout groups happening.
Yeah, I know. That's why I left.
Oh, okay. Oh.
Do you get involved in any of the direct service work at all, or are you primarily doing other things?
No, I'm the office manager here, so I don't work with our sites. I have my degree is in psychology, so I have a mild background in some stuff like this. So Ramiro is asking, for help. I'm gonna join them. Or maybe if he's asking for help, do you want me to assign you to room 9? You can pop back whenever.
What is the question?
It just says that he's asking for help and it's asking me to join the room, but I'm wondering if they want help with the exercise, which makes me think that you would be more fit to help.
Do you mind going in first and finding out if it's administrative first, and then I can come?
So our goal,
Hello, seemed like you guys needed help.
yes, we don't have the
document.
Yeah, we don't have it. None of us.
Okay. Did it appear in the chat? I know somebody said that it didn't appear.
It did, but then it wasn't letting me open it at all. It was taking me to another screen, like to save it onto my computer.
So I did that same thing, and then after I saved it, when I clicked on it again in the chat, then it opened up for me in like a PDF. So I think if you save it first and then click on it again, you should be able to view it.
Okay, but now that I opened up the chat and it's like that link is no longer in here.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me go back to the other, which I should fully be able to. Oh gosh. Okay, just a second. Okay, so now that they're in the breakout room, they don't have the document anymore in the chat.
Oh,
That particular group, nobody was able to download it before.
oh, okay. I think I still can do it.
Oh, this is weird. It went away from me too.
Yeah, it's there now. I just put a new paste
Send
in.
a message to everybody. Let me see if I can send a message to. You don't want to type though. Oh.
Hi.
Yeah, let me unplug my headphones so she can hear.
Hey, how are you?
can. Speakers. Oh my gosh. No, now my speaker's weird. I can't. I'll just put it back in. That's okay. Okay. Can you hear? I don't know. Just put your headphones back in. Don't worry about me. Okay. Chelsea. That's okay. Let's see. Did no one responded back? I don't think they can. Might need to pop into a room and see how it runs. Do-do-do. Maybe pop in a room and see how they're doing.
Hopefully it's just the one group that's not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pop back in there and see if they could see it now. Were you guys able to see the document?
No.
Okay, let me see if I can drop it in here. Where did it save? Downloads? No. Documents. That's usually where it saves sometimes. Well, I have it up here, but I don't know where it's saved. Just save it to my desktop. So it is there. There we go. Almost. Okay, can you guys see it in the chat now?
Yeah, it looks like something came up. Let me see here. So save. Oh, it says you don't have permission to save on this location. Contact administration to obtain permission. So somebody else might
Your screen.
I have
have to
it.
try. Okay.
I have it now.
Oh, sorry guys, but teamwork. Yes. Way to be.
Thank you.
Yes. Man,
Did it work?
finally, I ended up saving it and then sending it to them.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Doing your magic here. How much time are we looking at yet? Did you
I don't know
set-
how long they've been in those rooms. It's 11:30, but I don't know when I
It
started.
might say if you open it up, the breakout,
If I open
click
I-
that.
Yeah.
Doesn't say how long they've been in
Did you set it for a certain time or did we just not? Okay. I think it's been pretty close to 10 minutes probably, do you think?
I might be only closer to 5. I feel like sometimes when I panic, time feels like it's
Yeah.
taking longer. I feel like it hasn't been as long. And that one group just got started, but maybe everybody else is done.
Yeah, I don't want to cater just to that group. Although going over 10, let's call it 7.5. How about that for a compromise? So,
Sounds good.
let's go for another 2 minutes and then maybe give them that warning.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chelsea.
there.
I'll say 1 minute warning.
Okay. How many groups did that end up being? Of 12 or so, probably.
Alicia, I'm guessing your room is done with its conversation. Close that.
Oh my God, have I been muted this whole time?
All right. I think everyone's back. Yeah, my apologies. I know there was one group that unfortunately hadn't been able to download it in time. So I hope you found something instructive to talk about, that I trust that the other ones did. Again, I don't think we're going to spend a lot of time debriefing, although I would be very curious about what strengths that you all found in Sarah that you could just name in the chat box. I think that's a nice bridge to where we're heading here. Anyone at all? What did you see in Sarah that you could say she had that fighting spirit? Absolutely. Yeah, she was determined. She's resilient, given everything she had experienced. She's strong-willed. Even though she didn't graduate from high school, she bounced back, right? And kept on going. Has a real sense of determination, independence. She's learned a lot on her own. Absolutely. Yeah. And these are all things that we can look at and say, there's probably a but that can go with it too. She's strong, but she has a fighting spirit, but she's independent, but the point here is both are true, right? And when we accentuate the good stuff, even though it's maybe not perfect in the way it's being manifest, we can still honor and identify for people what we see in them. And we can even ask them too, what they see as their own strengths, which they may or may not be forthcoming about. But, you know, I even think about somebody who's on the streets and is basically a hustler, you know, nickel and diming their way around their lives. You know, we can see that person as having really good sales skills, being able to be pretty able to bring people to their point of view and to contribute. And so pretty much anything that people exhibit can be reframed in some kind of a strengths-based way, I do believe. All right, I think what I'll do here is just bring us back to our slides and have us move forward here. So we're now going to move into focusing more on the idea of providing trauma-informed, healing-centered care. And I'm just curious, what comes to your mind? How do you think about it? Do you have any particular kind of phrase or ideas about what trauma-informed, healing-centered care entails? chances are you won't be wrong because there are many, many pathways to healing, many pathways to recovery, and there is no one right way for people to enter into a recovery process. So what do you think it might be? Whether you're providing something or whether a person's experiencing something. I'll just take a look in the chat box here. Yeah, it's a path forward. Yeah, for sure. A path that hopefully is a less unsafe path and a more constructive path. Love that definition. What else is it? It's being alongside people. Yeah, it's done in relationship. It's very hard for people to heal from trauma without some context of a caring relationship. And Katie, absolutely, this idea of being curious about what might have happened to a person instead of sort of wondering, oh, what's wrong with them, or if not asking that, thinking in our own minds, you know, what are this person's deficits? What are they doing poorly in life? You know, and it's a total package. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that, but I think what we're saying here is it encompasses many, many different things. And actually, Gail, I think that is a nice segue into my own personal definition that I borrowed, I'm sure, from somebody, but it's the sum total of hundreds of thousands of small words and tiny actions. And maybe they're not always tiny, but it turns out that, you know, the way that we are with people, the way that we interact, the beliefs we have about them that get conveyed are incredibly powerful, because interestingly, a person who has been traumatized is very skillful in having what I'll call a sixth sense in, let's just say it, in seeing through bullshit, right? They have a really keen observational ability to know when people are faking it or trying to pretend or pretending to care, and who are not genuine, who are not actually there for the right reasons. And so that's one of the reasons why I love this work, and it's so compelling, because it's real and it cuts through all of the stuff that we sometimes put in the way, the labels, the protocols, and gets to real relationships. So again, the sum total of hundreds of thousands of tiny words, tiny actions, expressions, glimpses, that kind of thing, I think is a helpful way to think about moving forward. And it's also this idea of helping people meet challenges and to set goals. Absolutely, as Stanton says, to really look forward in a kind of purposeful kind of way, and in looking forward in a mindful way about, you know, what's possible as some next steps, and where can we go from here. And again, this is where motivational interviewing as an approach is very, very helpful to start helping people identify their hopes, their goals, their aspirations, and then begin to think of ways that they can move towards them. And Garrett, I'm so appreciative of the idea of always holding out hope and keeping hope alive, as they say, right? But understanding that hope, even though it's likely to be held in fairly small doses by people, I think there's always within people some sense of hope. Otherwise, why would they keep going day after day? And so even when people express hopelessness, I think we can still acknowledge there's probably within a glimmer of hope, because that's what keeps them going. And I do think that you and I can be hope bearers for people sometimes. That is, we can be the ones who can hold out hope for people when they can't necessarily see it for themselves. And they borrow from that bank, if you will. They make small withdrawals of the hope that we have for them, and begin to hopefully add it into their own way of seeing themselves. So again, the metaphor here, I'm going to show you a video. This is a video from an organization called Changing Minds Now that's very focused on trauma and recovery. I'm going to be sending you handouts that have lots of resources, including some online resources, including this video, and there's a companion video with it too, that I don't think we'll get to see, but it's about a woman named Unique. But what I'm going to ask you to do is watch this video. It's about 5 minutes or so, and keep two things in mind. What are the adverse childhood experiences that Chad experienced, and what impact did they have on him? And then secondly, who and what was helpful in helping him move on to that healing pathway? And so let's go ahead and listen again. I recognize that videos like this can bring up memories of our own experiences. And I guess I would just encourage you to be mindful of that and take whatever steps you need to take to feel okay and safe in all of this. All right, here we go. Oh, excuse me for a moment. Here we go.
It's just hard with that. I mean, I was just a kid. I mean, because here everybody knew our business, knew what was happening to us, and it was brutal. Oh my God, there's a school. If you go right up here, there's a turn, and you can situate it.
It's a tough thing back here.
Yeah. This is crazy. There were some good times though, like we'd have a good 30 minutes or so before we heard the sliding glass door open. And one day he came in and he actually had pizza, like Supreme Pizza. And another day, everything, it was fine. And another day he came in, for no reason, he just smashed my mom's head against that cabinet there. Just thinking of, just to the left of where they're playing, it's where my brother and I would play. My dad, he would come home and we had to be really good at sports and stuff, so. There's one time where we were sitting, I knew it was coming. I knew my brother, Bobby, I knew that he would be the one to bear the brunt of it. And so I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Chad reminds me of a lot of the kids that come through here. Angry, very angry. And you could tell he just didn't want to connect with anybody. And you could tell he was hiding something. He always came in with a nervous stomach. My stomach hurts, my stomach hurts. And he finally came clean and told me his father had major anger issues. He said, you know, I need to talk to somebody. And I instantly thought of Coach Morrow.
Chad wasn't a football player per se. He was just a kid that had energy that needed to do something. He needed to be a part of something because I don't think he had anyone as a role model or someone showing him what to do.
Coach Morrow was the only person I really trusted in this town. He was always there.
Yeah. There was times I would give him a ride home. We would talk, sometimes we wouldn't talk. But it was interesting to have a discussion with someone, a young man who had no one to talk to.
He was the only one there for my graduation. Even my family wasn't there.
You're doing good. You're okay.
I just remember, when you were walking across, I just remember looking up. He had this big old just ear to ear grin.
It takes a village to raise a child. And it doesn't matter what nationality, what race, we're all from the human race. If you interact with someone, it shows them that you care.
Good memories, you know? You gotta hold on to those.
It's love thy neighbor. It's what we should do.
When's the last time you saw him?
About 8 years ago. And actually, right over here is Lucille's barbecue. The best barbecue you'll ever have in your life. And Coach Morrow actually took me there, like after high school graduation. But take this right. It's gonna be your first right over there. Just pull in, not this one, but. I freaking knew it. I freaking knew it. I did too. I knew something was up.
No,
I knew something with that. I knew it. I knew y'all were doing something.
No, you didn't. There he is.
I heard you were in town. I knew you couldn't pass up some Lucille's, man. Oh, good to see you. I'm so proud of you. Done well. Done well.
So I wonder if we might begin by just thinking about some of the specific, we only got a very small snapshot of Chad's life at home, but what can we pick up from even what was said that were sources of significant trauma for him? There are some that are fairly overt and some that are a little bit more subtle and hidden. Yeah, he certainly witnessed a great deal of abuse, especially toward his mom and his brother, but he also suffered a great deal of personal trauma as a result of that and other things of watching it. You get a sense of neglect. He didn't have anyone to talk with, right? And maybe he wasn't neglected in terms of being fed and all of that, but there was another kind of emotional neglect that happened, and he witnessed assault. What about some of the more subtle things? Yeah, you get a sense that he was really feeling alone, certainly in terms of his caregivers. At the very beginning, there's the comment that everybody knew our business. In what way might that be traumatizing? And I'll just say a few words about it from my point of view, but feel free to add to that. But I think if I were in Chad's position and everyone knew my business and yet no one actually intervened, that would be incredibly traumatizing, it seems to me, that nobody was stepping forward to really see. Now, maybe it wasn't seen for what it was, but weren't any neighbors curious, or wasn't there some sense of somebody being curious about what was going on? There was the embarrassment. No one cared enough to rescue. I guess that's a lot of what I'm feeling here. A lot of shame he developed, right? And maybe he thought everyone knew, exactly. And maybe he thought this was just the way things are. I don't know. There was also something about the violence being not constant, but intermittent, that you never knew when it was coming. One day it's a pizza and the next day it's, violence against mom. And so it's that stepping around on eggshells, which also, maybe the violence only happens once a month or every 3 months. It doesn't matter, right? But there's always that possibility because your brain is now trained to really be looking out for that. What about the piece, we had to be good in sports? What does that tell us? We had to be good in sports. I'm presuming that was coming from Dad. Now, we don't know what this is all about, but he would get a sense that maybe dad was living his life through his kids, and their success in sports was something that he could take some pride in. And so, Katie, thank you. You put it in much better terms. A performance-based acceptance, right? A conditional acceptance that if you do well, I'm proud of you, but if you don't, then, I'm not. And so it had to do with love, even moral, exactly. How loved am I? Well, it depends on how good I am at things, right? Whether it's sports or school or anything else. So there are a lot of layers here. Now let's take a look at who and what was helpful in healing from trauma. And I think we would all agree that Coach Morrow in particular was helpful. If we can just focus on Coach Morrow for a bit. Coach Morrow is not a professionally trained, he didn't sit through this workshop. He's not a professionally trained counselor, psychologist, social worker. He's a football coach. We don't know anything about, he seems like a really good human being, right? But what are the things he does and says and the attitudes that he has that come through as being incredibly trauma informed and helpful to the healing pathway that Chad goes on? He's absolutely encouraging, yeah. And I love the piece about, he wasn't a football player per se, which says to me that Coach Morrow wasn't as, he wasn't caught up in his team being totally successful. He was caught up in giving youth a chance to get involved in something active and physical. And what I love about the football metaphor is, or involvement is, what a great place for Chad to put some physicality out there and to move his body and even attack and block and do all the things that happen in football that are a way of fighting back, if you will, in a way that he maybe didn't have a chance before. But he was absolutely noticed. He was seen. He was not judgmental. He said, and he saw the need for Chad to get involved in something. He didn't just sit down and talk with him for coffee. He saw the need for activity. And that's something for us to clue into when we think about being trauma informed. Talk itself can be helpful, but it's rarely enough. And so that's one reason why yoga, that's one reason why physical exercise, running, or whatever that level of activity is, and getting involved in new experiences. That's why so much of that is all part of being trauma informed. And yeah, he had a chance to vent, to get some of that anger out in a socially, appropriate way in that case. And he saw a role model in Coach Morrow. I really appreciate, Jamie, you're pointing that out, because I'm sure the coach didn't say, oh, this guy needs a role model, so I'll be that. I think he was just being himself, but somewhere he understood that there was a caring, loving adult needed in Chad's life. And he supported achievements, absolutely. He listened, and he makes the comment that, sometimes we would just sit and not talk at all, which is its own form of just being with somebody in solidarity with them without feeling a need or pressure to fix or make things better. And I love that part. And that's part of being trauma informed, is simply being with people, sometimes in silence, in a compassionate act, and then sometimes with words as well. And as a result, Chad says, he's the only person I trusted in town. He's the only person who came to my high school graduation. He took me to Lucille's, right? Anything else about Coach Morrow and the role he played and the function, if you will, in being a trauma-informed presence in Chad's life? Anything else you noticed? Yeah, Katie, so helpful to point out. Imagine if he had gone out trying to fix Chad in some way. I don't even know what he would have done to do that, but it would have almost certainly backfired, or Chad would have seen through that there was an ulterior motive, right? Instead, he had that presence about him from which, and don't we mostly learn from people by their presence, their way of being, by our own mimicry, if you will, instead of what people tell us and all the good advice they give us. And as a result, Chad changed and he didn't turn into his dad. That's a really helpful, and there's a certain form of prevention, right? Of helping ensure that there's not a generational carrying on of that trauma. Now, I want to tell you something. I do have a problem with this video. And I mean that slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I have a problem with the school counselor, and you don't have to agree with me, but I wonder if any of you have any kinds of comments, reaction or response to the school counselor who says, Chad reminds me a lot of the kids who come through here. He's angry, very angry. And you could tell he just didn't want to connect with anybody. And you could tell he was hiding something. He always came in with a nervous stomach. My stomach hurts, my stomach hurts. He finally came clean and told me his father had a major anger issue. He said he needed to talk to somebody, and I immediately thought of Coach Morrow. So that's a verbatim of what she said. And I don't want to belittle this person, but I do think it's important for us to look at the language and the tone that she uses in describing Chad and see if we have any concerns about that. Yeah, good. Yeah, she's kind of clinical and unattached, isn't she, for one? She's not seeing through his eyes, and she's focused on that angry presentation, which is getting in the way, which, as you rightfully point out, Stanton, is standing in for hurt and harm done, right? There's a judgmentalness for it, sure. Even this idea of coming clean, I don't know, I kind of cringe personally at that. Maybe she's burnout. Maybe she has her own trauma she's dealing with. That's a very compassionate thing to think about here, and probably one to take in mind. But it comes across, like you say, Stacy, as if Chad was to blame for hiding his home life. Exactly. Yeah. And so I'm going to suggest to you that there might actually be another way to say this, and there are actually hundreds of ways to say this. But I wonder if each of you who wish could just take one piece of this, whatever you choose, and just by a turn of phrase, make it a little bit more strengths-based, a little more trauma-informed, a little more life-giving, a little more compassionate. What are some, and don't write the whole thing out, but what are some different phrases that you might ask just to reframe some of these things? I'd love to see your ideas here. And this is something we need to do in real life all the time, because oftentimes we do start in that judgmental, accusatory mode, but then we need to say, wait a minute, how can I frame this in a way that's much more compassionate, and putting ourselves in Chad's shoes. Yeah, we could even say he felt safe enough to share what was happening at home. Beautiful, yeah. And there was a bravery, a sense of courage in coming forward to ask for help, absolutely. And he may need somebody to talk to, perhaps about what's going on. Yeah, for sure. I'm gonna just sort of building upon some of the things you put here, I'm gonna put one example of what it might sound like, and I'm gonna read it out loud and see what your responses are. And again, this could be stated in many ways, but what if she had said, Chad reminds me of a lot of the kids who come through here, okay? He was visibly upset and seemed to be holding something inside that was really bothering him. I sensed he might be too afraid or embarrassed to talk about it. You could tell he desperately wanted to connect with somebody, but wasn't sure who to trust. Not surprisingly, his body, his stomach was signaling the stress he was experiencing. And over time, Chad was able to confide in me about the abuse and violence going on at home with his dad. He said he really needed to talk with somebody who felt safe with. And when I suggested Coach Murrow, Chad said he'd be willing to give it a try. Now, each of you could take this and rewrite it in your own way, and it would be perfectly fine. But I think it's, you can see in the kind of the comparison of what it takes and how significant it is to be able to reframe things in a way that's much more trauma informed. Yeah, Jamie, he always came in with that nervous stomach, which makes me worried about his stress. Exactly, because we know stress so often is held there. So, I mean, I think for obvious reasons, I point this out, but I think that language matters. And so even the use of specific things, and there are exercises we could do. I don't necessarily intend to do it now, but sometimes we use phrases that are less than helpful. Like we talk about people in a deficit-based way of putting themselves at risk. Well, maybe, but there might be a more strengths-based of talking about that, right? Or we might say that the person's manipulative or entitled or trying to get one over on us, or they're grandiose. There are lots of terms we use that might be okay depending on the eyes of the beholder, but other times might be less so. Any other comments? Yeah, that distinction of violence, major anger issues for sure. I think one of the things I'll just point out here is that you don't have to have a degree in anything to be a compassionate human being and to be trauma informed. And that's the beauty of this approach. Now, if you do have training in psychology and social work and medicine and nursing and being a community health worker and all that, that's great, that helps. But really it's bringing our best selves forward and meeting people in a way that partners with them, is accepting, is compassionate, and really evokes from people their own strengths. All right. Boom. I could interpret that many different ways, but whatever boom means, I'm going to take it as agreement with what I said, but maybe something just ignited in your office space too. I have no idea. So anyway, why is all this relevant? Well, again, this is somewhat repetitive, but what we know is that trauma has a direct impact on how, on people's overall health and well-being. We know that for one. So that's something we need to be aware of, but it also has an impact on how people engage with us in services. And so again, going back to that flight, fight, freeze, or face, people on different days even might be in a space where they just aren't going to be there. They're feeling dissociated, they're feeling depressed, or other days when they're feeling angry, they're upset, they've been, they're ready to fight back on anything. And then there are other days when maybe they're actually ready to sort of be willingly able to talk about what's been going on in a way that they're able to kind of engage their whole being in that. So I guess that's one reason I would say is that whenever we encounter people and we have relationships with them, just like you and I, we show up as different people on different days, right? And let's look for those moments. Let's look for those times when people can have a sense of a little more groundedness, if you will, centeredness, and an ability to look at things a little bit more clear-eyed. And that might just be for a few minutes or moments even. But all of those interactions, when we talk with people and there's acknowledgement and where we're looking for any statements of a desire to have things be different, that's when we can start guiding our conversations with them to look for a pathway forward. Sometimes we just have to roll with where people are at and not try to use that as being a time of being therapeutic or being accusing, and just acknowledge to people that, yeah, I get it. You're feeling really upset today, and that's okay. That's okay. And we don't have to talk about a lot of other things. We can just be there. Or maybe we can engage in some exercises or things that we can do to help you decrease some of that. But we don't demand that, of course. This is also relevant because I'm imagining people will and do, especially if you've created a safe relationship, they will unveil some of that Pandora's box and share some secrets and tell you about some past trauma or some current trauma going on that you would have had no knowledge of. What do we do with that? Let me ask you, what do we do with that? What are some basic premises of how we respond if somebody reveals to us about some past abuse, neglect, trauma. It can be related to anything, but particularly if it was sort of early childhood stuff or things that they've been holding on to for a long time. Any thoughts on what are you thinking about? What are you wanting to say maybe to receive that? And hopefully you wouldn't say something like, well, that's not something we can get into here. That's above my pay grade, or that's not for me, or I don't know enough about that. And, sometimes we say things that are really off-putting that really pushes things back into the box further. But absolutely thank them for sharing it with you and for feeling safe enough to do that. And appreciate the fact, as Stanton says, that they felt safe enough, they felt courageous enough to step forward and give you what they gave you. And we can absolutely provide that empathy of saying, I'm so sorry that happened to you. You know, it's not taking responsibility, it's just saying, oh my God, you know, that sounds horrible, that sounds terrible, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I appreciate your bravery in sharing that, and your honesty and your willingness to look that, you know, in the eye, to really name it for yourself. And sometimes part of it is normalizing it too, of being able to say to people, you know, sadly, this is a story I've heard before in different forms, but you're not alone in this. There's something about that, you're not alone in this, that often is really helpful too for people. And Kristen, thank you, yeah, for that. And so the other part is then what, right? And what we do want to avoid doing is asking people about details of the experience. I think you all know this intuitively, but as soon as we start asking people for, well, tell me what happened and when it happened and what was going on, and you know, what were the sights and smells and what did they say? As soon as we start getting into that, then we're being voyeurs and we're not being helpful. What we're actually doing is we're engaging in something that is based on our own sense of voyeurism and not on being helpful. But what we can do is, after normalizing, after acknowledging it, we can begin to explore with the person what might next steps be in order to move in a direction of a healing pathway. And you do that in small incremental steps. But the first thing is to make sure that they feel heard, seen, they're understood. And the other part is that you're there with them, that you're not going to be pushed away by that. You're not going to abandon them, that you will appreciate that and take that into account in your work with them. You might even begin to ask questions like, you know, I recognize for some people, different things kind of bring those things up again. They're like triggers, right? I'm wondering, what are some of the things for you that you experience that bring these things to the fore that are really disconcerting? What are things I could do differently? Because the thing about triggers is we never know whether the tone of our voice or how we look or the color of our skin or whatever it is, you know, the perfume we wear or the cologne, we never know whether that might be something that brings up past memories. And so we can ask and begin to understand that, so that we are not creating at least that in our own relationship with the person. All right, a few more things. We also know that when we understand the impact of trauma and the fact that it does increase people's factors for entering into less than healthy behaviors, we can begin to make that correlation with people, and we can begin to talk with them about behaviors they're engaged in and what purpose they serve. If you ask a person who's using opiates, you know, tell me, what do they do for you? That's a way of being trauma informed, because you're saying, I get it. You're using, at least in part, because there's some good being served by using opiates. What are the benefits? What do they do for you? And then of course we can also ask, and you know, what are the downsides? What's not working around using opiates? And we can fill in the blank with other things too. but getting curious in a compassionate way about the function that different behaviors people engage in is a really important way of being trauma informed without just saying, you've got to change that, you can't do that. And then we can also think about how understanding trauma can help us better manage risk. It is not uncommon for people experiencing trauma to engage in some sort of self-cutting, self-burning, anything that we call it self-harm. But that behavior oftentimes, again, the function of that is oftentimes that people have begun to not feel anything emotionally and even physically. They feel like zombies. And this is to varying degrees, of course. But one way we can understand this self-cutting behavior, and it's often on the arms or the legs or burning oneself with a cigarette butt, is in the experience of feeling that pain and maybe seeing the visible results of it. It actually, interestingly, brings people to a place of feeling more alive and more in tune with their feelings. Now, paradoxically, that's a very paradoxical thing, but if we don't understand that that might be the function of what's going on, and instead we see that as bad behavior or even suicidal behavior, then we enter into a situation where we are not seeing clearly what's happening. Thoughts on that? I'm sure many of you have had the experience of working with people, or maybe you yourself have engaged in those kinds of behaviors. All right, I'll yeah, and Stan, are you saying you might share a story here, or are you saying just in general you might share a story with somebody that might show them, help them understand how they might feel? If you are interested in sharing a story, feel free to unmute and speak up. If not, I agree with you that that just sharing an illustration of ways that people can feel in more healthy ways is a good one. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Cindy. So here's an interesting one. How is it that we might re-traumatize people? Generally not intentionally, but unintentionally, and sometimes intentionally. But what are ways that you think about in the services we provide? Maybe not you personally, but in the services in general, in our organizations, our teams, our institutions. What are ways that people often feel re-traumatized by the way we've set up things, and also by the interpersonal interactions that people have? And reading, Katie, your comment, understanding that behaviors we may deem bad does have some benefit, and not judging helps create a safe space. Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. Sorry, things are flying by now. But the idea that if we see things that are bad, that are unhealthy, for example, that is important to recognize. And then the key is not to put that on people and judge them. And as Stanton has been saying, help them find new ways then to find more helpful ways, like exerting energy in, or shadow boxing, or doing yoga, or whatever it is, right? So Brittany, some ways, by not having diverse helpers, right? People who are closer to the life experience, or the gender, or the sexual orientation, or the race mix, whatever it is. But if we're all white people, for example, serving people of color, that's not diverse. And an example of a sexually assaulted female might need a female to help. Exactly. So there's a good concrete example. And it's really a matter of asking people their choices around those things. And again, honoring autonomy, choice is so critical in being trauma informed. And you all know this, but even in the smallest ways, would you like to sit here, or would you like to sit here? Or shall we take a walk outside you know, do you want to walk around the block, or do you want to, would you like a cup of coffee or some tea? I mean, all of these choice points may seem mundane to us, but everything we do in even those tiny, small ways are basically saying, I'm not here to control you. I'm not here to take over. I'm here to honor your own decisions and choices that you make. And exactly, you might come off as an authority figure when that's not the intention, for sure. I'm going to do this. I'm going to suggest we take a real brief break, like a 3-minute break. It's 12:16, and we come back at 12:19, just because I think it's, I want to honor my word, and also because I think having a brief break would be helpful. And then we'll come back. So if you would, please take that brief break now, and I'll see you in 3 minutes. All right, here we go. I went ahead and put a list here, and we're not going to go into each one, but there are many ways that we can potentially re-traumatize people, and I think we just need to acknowledge that. I want to point out one or two of these, and these are all, some of these are coming from the thinking around white supremacy culture, but whenever we begin to think about an expert recipient's way of helping rather than a partnering approach, that in and of itself is less than trauma informed. Or when we think there's only one right way forward, including when people come up with trauma informed programs or kind of systems, if you will, we should be wary if somebody says, yeah, I found it, this is it, because there are multiple pathways forward. And also around either or thinking. Whenever we get engaged in dyadic thinking, it's either this way or that way, my way or the highway, we begin to, because this is actually what happens when people are traumatized, they tend to think in those very separate ways of black and white, right or wrong. And in fact, there's a lot of nuance and grayness in life. And so when people start to be able to see some of the in-between space, that's a sign that they're becoming more, they're healing more, because when we get stuck in that very dyadic thinking, it actually creates sort of an inability to move forward. All right, so again, I think we talked already a lot about ways that trauma affects people's engagement in services. When we see people who don't follow through with appointments or referrals, or they change their mind about something, you know, we could say they temporarily lost motivation, which is an MI way of looking at it, but we can also look at it and say, what's underneath that? Well, I wonder oftentimes, is it a fear of change of any kind, even if it's change that's good for us? Is it avoidance of something that is unknown? Might there be memory impairment? Because we know that our memories don't work as sharply when we are in that revved up state, right? Or decision making. Is it possible that the person's not able to make decisions as wisely based on not only their knowledge, but also based on their capacities to think things through? So again, always bearing in mind that there's a backstory of how the brain and the body are working that might have some effect on people's daily functioning. And this all matters, of course, because we want to provide better services and care. We want to be effective. We want to stay on the job, hopefully, and experience reduced levels of vicarious trauma and so forth. And so again, I'm going to send you these slides. You can take a look through them if you want, but for the moment, I'm not going to linger on some of these things for the sake of moving ahead. I have a short video here, and this was actually developed for community health centers, and many of you work out of community health centers, so I think this is appropriate to context. But again, just to hear in another person's words what we're talking about in terms of this idea of trauma-informed care. So here we go.
You know the old saying, don't judge a book by its cover? Well, the same is true when you assess a patient. Hi, I'm Dr. Cruz. Early in my career, I noticed a pattern with some of my patients. They often had multiple health issues, were uneasy during office visits, and frequently visited the emergency department. But worst of all, they never got better despite multiple visits. Then I realized something. From an early age, many of my patients were exposed to trauma and adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. This includes emotional, sexual, or physical abuse, violence, neglect, discrimination, poverty, and other adverse events. ACEs are more common in the US than you'd think. In fact, 60% of US adults have one ACE, 25% have 3 or more ACEs, and 16% have 4 or more. ACEs occur in all socioeconomic groups, but are more common in low-income and minority populations. For young children, repeated exposure to trauma can impact brain development and literally rewire the brain's response to stress. So as they grow up, many struggle with issues related to emotional regulation, like depression, anxiety, or substance use disorders. Trauma survivors are also more often at risk for chronic diseases, behavioral health problems, and even suicide. Knowing all this, I began to rethink my approach to care. Instead of asking patients, "What's wrong with you?" I ask, "What happened to you?" Recognizing that life experiences are often a root cause of poor health is integral to improving patient care. Trauma-informed care has helped me take these experiences into account, providing greater insight into my patients' needs and how to address them. Here are 5 key ways that healthcare organizations can gradually integrate trauma-informed care into their practices to help patients and staff. First, build awareness and generate buy-in. Involve both staff and patients in adopting a trauma-informed approach. Second, invest in a trauma-informed workforce. Hire staff that embrace trauma-informed care and provide training not only for clinical staff, but also for non-clinical employees like front desk workers or security guards, who are often the face of your organization. Next, create an environment that is safe and welcoming for patients and staff. Engage patients in meaningful ways. Ask how they feel and listen. You can also build trust by involving them in their own treatment planning. Finally, identify and treat trauma. Consider a screening approach that works for your patients and ensure that treatments and referral sources are available. These changes take time, but each step improves our ability to connect with and care for patients. Today, our patients appreciate the changes we've made. Plus, our staff is more in tune with patients, so work is less stressful and more rewarding. Trauma-informed care. It can truly transform the caregiving experience from being treaters to being healers.
Before we move on to thinking about trauma-informed and trauma treatment, any comments on the video itself? Any thoughts? I actually want to make one up front, and that is when she says, instead of asking what's wrong with you, what happened to you, I don't think she means literally going up to people and say, what happened to you? I just want to be clear about that. But what we do want to be clear about is we're curious. We are wondering what might be there in the background that has actually helped development of some of these ways of being in the world. So yeah, Brittany, it's all about culture, isn't it? And I think there's not enough emphasis either, including in my training, but that whole communal and cultural kind of trauma that happens, and that each of our cultures, and we all live in multiple cultures oftentimes, have their own built-in and traumatizing kind of beliefs and ways of seeing the world and practices, and so at least that's my riff on what you're saying there. And training non-medical staff, I think, is absolutely important. And front desk and security, absolutely. So one of the things that I've not brought up is that there is a whole another kind of field of thinking about how do we implement trauma-informed care into entire organizations. And I've been involved in doing some of that with actually some local community health centers in the state of Washington and beyond. But that's another thing that I'll just say here, is that that's another area that I would encourage you all to think about, because it's not all on you, and it's not all on your team, and it's not just about interpersonal relationships. Trauma happens at many, many layers and different levels. And so the idea of implementing trauma-informed care would be to really use a process to look at policies and procedures, to look at what the welcome is like at the reception, what the front desk and security folks, how they're interacting with people, and all of these things. And so it's a whole person organizational culture that actually is really important in looking at here. So just to move ahead, I want to make sure we're clear about the difference between trauma treatment, trauma-informed. And so I'm not going to linger on this a long time, but there are a number of treatments that have been developed and are developing over the past maybe 25 years or so. It's not been for a long time. In fact, the term trauma informed was only something that was kind of started to be used, as I understand, in the early 2000s. But many attempts have been made, probably historically throughout history, to help people heal from trauma. I think probably some of the common sense ways that people have used that are not punitive have been incredibly helpful, kind of like a Coach Morrow, you know, but in other cultures and other times, it was probably somebody who just walked alongside people, listened to them, honored their dignity, respected them, maybe helped them find work or activity that allowed them to use their bodies in a way that they weren't counted on to be productive so much as just be engaged and involved in the community. All of these things, and particularly for those of you as community health workers, anything you can do to be thinking about ways to help people connect with healthy people and connections and organizations, and you too being a healthy connection for that person, but helping people be engaged then in activities that are more meaningful and are ones that even when they are able to give back to others, like many of you in this room, I'm sure, are in the process of giving back from the own healing you've experienced. That's all good. And so it's not, we don't want to medical model this one too much, right? Now that said, some of the treatment approaches are more medical model oriented. And you can see here, there are different kinds of cognitive behavioral therapies, exposure therapy, DBT is dialectical behavioral therapy. Marsha Linehan, some of you know her work. EMDR is a newer treatment. Again, not all of these work well for everybody by any means, and not all work as well for people with long-term trauma versus more the more kind of shorter-term trauma exposure. Hypnotherapy, psychodynamic, different kinds of therapies. There are medications that can be helpful to alleviate symptoms of anxiety, depression. Some people talk about confronting the inner void, helping people kind of think deeply into their soul, kind of thinking about who they are, who they want to be in the world, and imagining and acting out in positive ways how to become that person. As you can tell, none of these are cookie cutter, easy, done, we're done here. Some people will experience that with EMDR, for example, but which is kind of a reset of the brain in many ways. The other thing I'll just mention here, and it's not necessarily an accepted therapy, although it's becoming more so, is we know a lot of experience with psychedelics, with LSD, with MDMA, with mushrooms have literally been found in some studies to help to reset the brain, to create neural pathways for people to experience more compassion. And I had an experience like this with a taxi driver in LA about a year ago. He told me about his family. He was driving taxi. I said, "What do you like about it?" He said, "Oh, I have all this freedom, which I really like. Nobody's controlling me, right?" And he also said that I have the freedom then to stop by and check in on my dad, who has brittle diabetes and doesn't take care of himself. So I check in every few hours. I take my sister to school. She lives with an alcoholic mom, and it's not a good situation. But he started talking to me about his family life and his own growing up, and it sounded very abusive and neglectful and very traumatizing. And I asked at one point, I said, "So I'm curious, how do you attribute your own growing ability to act compassionately towards your dad, your sister, and to others? What do you give credit to that for?" And without batting an eye, he said, "LSD." And I said, "LSD?" And he said, and without getting too far into the weeds of it, but what he said is he felt like for him that he was able to experience a pretty immediate effect of having neural pathways in his brain opened that were open to his own sense of empathy and compassion that he had deep inside, but it was covered over. And then he went on to tell me that he no longer uses those substances, but he said, "I do yoga and I do meditation, I do mindfulness practice, and they accomplish the same thing for me." So all of that to say is that we're still learning about trauma treatment and therapy, and there are many pathways. And please don't take this as my endorsement for you to go out and use hallucinogens, but I'm just saying there's still a lot to be learned here. And so we need to keep our minds open. Comments, thoughts, anyone at all? Okay, I'll keep us moving. Feel free to type in the chat box. I wanted to point out an article to you that I'm going to send to you as well, but this is an article by Sean Ginwright, as you can see, from May 2018. It's pretty recent. And the reason I pointed out is you've heard me use the title and term sometimes healing centered. And one of the things about the term trauma informed is that it seems to be fairly compact in its scope. That is, somehow if we are more informed about trauma and its impact, that somehow that will be enough to change our practices. And to some degree that's true, but I really, really appreciate Sean Ginwright's approach of talking about not dismissing trauma-informed care, but expanding it to include the notion of healing and healing-centered practices. And so I'll share that with you. And he just says here, again, kind of what we've been saying is that trauma-informed care encourages support and treatment to the whole person, body, mind, spirit, soul, community, all of that. And we can't do it all, of course, individually, but we can do our own part in making a difference. And again, it's that attitude set that people are so much more than what just happened to them. And so, again, much the way that school counselor looked at Chad, that was a narrow way to look at him. That was seeing him through his trauma. But what if we saw him through his strengths, through the good stuff, and through his aspirations, and through so many skills and attributes and knowledge that he already had, and we really began to tap into that and help him strengthen his strengths. That's really at the essence of trauma-informed care. And it's always with the belief that recovery is possible and achievable regardless of where their starting point is. Now, it doesn't always happen, but even so, people make small incremental steps. And I'm sure there are people you have worked with or do work with who just seem to be getting nowhere, not making any progress in our view. But if we went back and revisited those situations and took a look, even the fact that the person keeps coming back, even the fact that the person at least intermittently does more healthy things than not, even if they relapse, I think if we can begin to focus our emphasis on the things that people are doing in the best way they know how, and as consistently as possible to move forward, and help them, encourage them in that, and help them strengthen those skills and those practices, that is taking us a long way towards being healing centered. So some basic principles we might talk about here is understanding trauma, promoting safety in all ways. I think that, obviously physical safety is important, especially for somebody who's leaving a battering relationship or leaving a home where abuse has taken place. But there's also the aspects of emotional safety and psychological safety that's really, really critical. And so again, we have to sometimes ask people, what would make you feel more safe in this situation? We can't assume what that is. Always supporting control, choice, autonomy. And by saying, this is a choice, this is a decision only you can make. I can't make it for you. And I know that people come to us sometimes and they say, well, what would you do? I just don't know what to do. And I wouldn't dismiss that outright, but I would also be careful about answering it directly and instead saying, I do have ideas, I have thoughts, but I don't know necessarily what's best for you. And so I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit more about your thoughts, your ideas about what might be most workable, what might be most advantageous for you. And that's the way that we honor control, choice, and autonomy. And then it might be that we say, and I do have a thought that I'll share with you, But even in sharing that with you, I want you to know that you can take it or leave it. You don't have to follow it. I'm just putting it out there as an idea, a suggestion. And then we offer it, and then we ask what the person thinks about it. And so these are all ways that we can support people in a very kind of trauma-informed way. In our organizations, are we hearing regularly from people who have lived experience of trauma and are in recovery, or even who are not in recovery? Are we getting a lot of input from people through groups, through focus groups, through an open door policy, through suggestion boxes, through any kind of thing that we're really inviting people? Are they serving on our boards? Are they serving people with that lived experience? I have become so convinced that people who have lived experience in a variety of things, homelessness, poverty, in overcoming racial trauma, in mental health and substance use issues, and physical health, who are in a recovery process and who have actually experienced what we might even call post-traumatic growth, are so important to have in our organizations to be part of our workforce. The relationship is always going to be central to a healing relationship, to being trauma-informed. And so creating, maintaining a trustworthy relationship, and part of that means not over-promising and therefore under-delivering, but instead maybe under-promising but over-delivering is often one way we think about how we best can work with people. Because if we promise too much and it doesn't go through, it really interferes with the trust that is often pretty fragile. Practicing cultural humility, big topic. I like the term humility just because I'm not sure there's an existence of cultural competence, or at least I don't have it, but can we at least be humble enough entering into any relationship that we're curious and interested about learning more about that person's belief systems and cultures and healing traditions and all of that, so that we can come away being enriched by that knowledge, but also having met them where they are and not imposing our cultural expectations on them. So integrated care really refers to just the fact that we need to address the whole person at the same time. And I know in community health centers, we talk about providing whole person care, and this is in keeping with that idea. And then this belief that recovery can and does happen for people. And sometimes it's dramatic and people sort of evolve into people we don't even recognize as where they were before. But then there are times when it's very subtle and incremental and they're on the journey. But anything we can do to continue to foster recovery and believe in people goes a long way. And I will say this, in my own experience, when people have come back and said something like, thanks, Ken, for helping me out or something, they've never said, thanks for being so trauma-informed, or thanks for practicing such exquisite motivational interviewing. What they do say are things like, thanks for giving me hope. Thanks for believing in me. Thanks for seeing things within me that I couldn't see for myself at the time. Those are the kinds of things that is the messaging that we will often hear from people. Oh yes, and then there's the secondary trauma, the vicarious trauma that is part and parcel of doing the work that we all do. We cannot eliminate it. It is actually something that we have to expect will happen, that we will feel, we will experience a secondary vicarious kind of trauma response, because we are witnesses to maybe third tier witnesses, but we're witness to the stories that tell us about their own trauma. And sometimes we're witness to the actual trauma itself, but we are not going to be unscathed by the work that we do. However, when we do practice good team care, good self-care, we have good supports in place, we have good supervision in place, we can minimize the secondary traumatization that happens. And it's just part of the pact, right? We choose willingly to enter into the lives of people who are suffering. And when we do that, and it's a wonderful calling, and it's also a risky calling. And so we need to just acknowledge that, I think. So tomorrow when we meet, we're going to talk about the mindset and heart set of motivational interviewing briefly, but I'm just bringing it up here because it also applies to trauma-informed practice, but I'm just going to leave it just there right now. But these are the kinds of attitude sets and mindsets that we want to bring forward in our work. We also want to bring forth core conversational skills that, again, we often borrow from the work of motivational interviewing, and using lots of ample open questions, doing a lot of reflecting in a skillful way, affirming people's strengths, summarizing in a way that helps people sort of bring ideas together. You're familiar with these, I'm quite certain, but these are all part of being trauma informed, of using these conversational skills in the spirit of being trauma informed. So in the time we have remaining yet, I just want to sort of open it up a little bit, but also I'll tell some stories, you tell some stories. But these are some key things that I would just invite you to think about when you yourself are interacting with people. And that is, first of all, dealing with hyperarousal. Now, first of all, it's dealing with your own hyperarousal, if you have it, and finding ways to be as grounded and centered and calm as possible in our interactions. Because as soon as we start reacting to things that people do and say, we're going to lose our cool and calm, and then we're going to react back, and then that just creates a chain of violence, actually, interpersonal violence. But we want to help people deal with their own hyperarousal too. And so one of the things we can do is we can help people find ways to calm themselves, and we can ask them up front, how do you do that? I ask you up front today, what are ways that you do that? And some of you talked about running and yoga and reading to kids and all these kinds of things. Well, identify those things and mindfully put them into practice. And we all need to do this because we're all hyper aroused at times. It's that being on edge piece. And so how do we continually try to bring ourselves to a level of calm, except for those times when we have to take action in an emergent kind of situation? Then we don't want to be calm at all. We want to be calm even in those times in terms of how we move forward. We need to help ourselves and others identify who we are as people. And this includes things like, how do other people see us? It might include taking a good self look in the mirror and asking ourselves, who am I? It might be asking ourselves questions like, is the life that I am living the same as the life that wants to live within me, which is a Parker Palmer quote. But asking ourselves, are the values that I hold to the same as, or are they matching with my behaviors in the world? Mindfulness practice, of course, can take many forms. And I think of our work in many ways as a mindfulness practice. We're needing to be mindful of our own well-being, our own physicality and emotional well-being, but also of the others. And so, but it starts with mindfulness practice that happens in a coached and practiced way oftentimes. But how can we help people become more mindful? And so how can we offer people in our programs yoga, stretching, physical workouts, music, dance, drama? These are all ways that we can help people become more self-aware and become more mindful of their own, what's happening within them. It seems simple, but relationships, as we've all said before, are critically important in all of this. And so how do we develop as healthy a relationship as possible with people in which we can be a guide, a catalyst, a difference maker in helping people both see through our modeling, but also through our guidance of possible ways to move forward. Bessel van der Kolk also talks about communal rhythms and synchrony. And here he's actually referring to his own involvement in South Africa in what was happening post apartheid in the Truth and Reconciliation movement. And he describes going into townships in Soweto and other poor townships and meeting with people there for the purpose of them attesting to the atrocities that they experienced. It was almost always women only, with some men, but a lot of the men were out working or had been disappeared or killed. But he would come together. But what he describes is, having he was with Archbishop Desmond Tutu and others who were leading all this. But it was an interesting kind of cycle of coming in and people sitting in silence and then creating kind of this rhythmic movement, just maybe a rocking back and forth. And maybe it became a little more demonstrative, but then there was often a song that was sung together, and there was a prayer offered, and there was this sense of communal rhythm and synchronicity. And then there was also the sharing in short pieces of some of the horrific things that happened, to tell the truth about what had happened, to bring it to the awareness, to name it, and then back again. And what I love about that is, I think we can translate that then in culture, but what are the ways in which you and I, and how we can help others develop that communal rhythm and synchronicity? And I'm curious what comes to your mind of what that might look like in a work setting. How can we develop these opportunities for connection and being in sync with each other? Certainly we do this through groups sometimes, through loss and grief groups. I think that's one way to do it. But I think there are also other ways we can do it in a more active kind of way. I think shared community meals can be that oftentimes. I think have people engaged in dance and movement and working out together, in walking, in lots of communal creativity, in decorating and painting, in developing ideas for celebrations of people's birthdays. So Gail, yeah, I think there are many pathways that this can take. I just want to be real clear that even though we often are taught that the medical model to healing is the one and only true way, it's not. There are so much more, and I'm not at all anti-medical model. I'm just saying it has its own confinement. And so be thinking about all these different sort of logical, sort of natural ways that people come together in which they're safe, they feel connected to each other, and people believe in each other. And that in and of itself is yet another source of just helping in the healing process. And I'll probably end here and leave a little space, but getting in touch is really the idea of getting in touch with our own bodies, with our own ways of being in the world. And oftentimes people are disconnected from their bodies in trauma, as we mentioned earlier. And so this is excuse the pun, but a touchy area, because we can't just come forward and offer different things, because touch is in and of itself a challenging thing for some people. But there are ways for people to get in touch through, particularly yoga, again, comes back to that, and through mindfulness practice, possibly through massage, chair massage perhaps, possibly through just finding their own ways to get in touch with their bodies. And I know for some people, that might involve some kind of physical workout or something like that. But again, these are just possible things to think about and pathways. In the long run, being trauma informed is also about being very person and patient centered. And it's tapping into people's own ideas, their own wisdom, their own expertise about what they believe would be most helpful to them in continuing on the healing journey. And so we want to support that, of course, and then offer other possibilities for them as well. I've been doing a lot of talking. I do so appreciate your engagement in the chat. And I realize we have about 5 minutes, but I'm just going to pause here. And as we prepare for wrapping up, what are the thoughts, ideas, maybe your own takeaways from the time we spent together today? What are you going to walk away with that's on your mind, that you're going to think more about, or maybe take some action on? All right. Well, it's possible that you're all exhausted and needing to go take a break, which makes perfect sense. I will thank you, Kristen. You say I'm by nature a fixer and I need to work on sitting with my peer. Yeah, that is such a common thing for those of us who are helping people, who naturally want to make things right, and they want people to feel better, have new experiences, and they want to be actively involved in helping fix people. And yet, as you're implying here, sometimes just being there in solidarity and instead waiting and tapping into people's own self-fixing approaches is much more helpful. Yeah, and thank you all for your encouraging words, kind words. Yeah, sometimes there isn't a fix, that's right. And sometimes it's living with something in the best way you know how. Yeah, being a compassionate person is not just a job, it's the way we interact with the world. So true. And I think, I mean, this is why people who are called like yourselves into this work are people who come to it, I think, for not just as your paid vocation, but your life vocation. There's a calling that I think most of us have, that we are called forth to be that expression of compassion in the world. And we do that in a way that tries to help people lead better lives. I'm going to invite you, if you're willing to hang in there for a minute or two. I'd like to share something with you as kind of a closing here. Just going through some slides. So much more we could have talked about, but I appreciate the pace and the time we've had together today and your involvement. I'm going to share my slides again, and I'll offer you this as a closing as we call this. Let's see. This is a fourfold Franciscan blessing, obviously comes from the Franciscans, but it's a beautiful non-religious blessing that I really love and love to share with people. So I'll share it with you. And that is, may you be blessed with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you will live deep in your heart. And may you be blessed with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people and the earth, so that you will work for justice, equity, and peace. May you be blessed with tears to shed for those who suffer, so that you will reach out your hand to comfort them and help them change their pain into joy. And may you be blessed with the foolishness to think that you can make a difference in the world, so that you will do the things which others say cannot be done. And with that, I say thank you so very much. And I will look forward to being with some of you, perhaps most of you, tomorrow for our dive into motivational interviewing. All right, farewell.